Benvingudes i benvinguts a la sisena edició organitzat per Citem Catalunya. Soc la Georgina Arnau, soc periodista, ara mateix treballant al programa de Weekly Mag de la xarxa i avui m'encarregaré de presentar aquesta primera jornada. Encetem un espai de trobada i de reflexió ciutadana al voltant del model de producció i consum de les tecnologies de la informació i també de la comunicació, un model que genera greus impactes socials i ambientals majoritàriament silenciats al Mobile World Congress. Òbviament, la pandèmia ha suposat un canvi substancial al llarg de la cadena, en les condicions dels treballadors, en l'exposició usuària a la tecnologia, i és per això que volem donar èmfasi als impactes de la pandèmia en aquest sector. Com tot darrerament, i òbviament aquesta nova edició tindrà peculiaritats i novetats lligades al moment actual, i per això us volem fer un recordatori, perquè aquesta sessió està sent gravada i us demanem mantingueu els micròfons en silenci. Si teniu preguntes, dirigir-les al xat des d'on les anirem recollint i us recordem que també disposem d'un sistema d'interpretació simultània anglès-espanyol, espanyol-anglès, català-anglès també espanyol per accedir a la traducció de l'idioma que desitgeu. Us heu de connectar al canal en l'idioma que en aquest cas preferiu. També us demanem que a les pauses no us desconnecteu sobretot, sinó que simplement apagueu la càmera i espereu a tornar. Ja ho anirem anunciant al llarg d'aquesta primera jornada. Bé, i tornant, com dèiem, a aquesta sisena edició, el Mobile Social Congress compta amb el suport de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i amb la col·laboració de Good Electronics, una xarxa que connecta i empodera organitzacions i individus que treballen per als drets humans a la cadena de subministrament electrònica. I és en aquesta edició que pretenem analitzar aquest impacte social i ambiental de la Covid-19 en aquest sector, sobretot el de l'electrònica global, aturant-nos, com sempre fem, en totes les fases de la seva cadena de subministrament. També donar visibilitat a les alternatives, com ara la sobirania tecnològica que aporten solucions als reptes actuals. Bé, doncs aquesta primera jornada del Congrés l'obrirem amb la benvinguda a càrrec del David Llistà, que és director de Justícia Global i Cooperació Internacional de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, un dels nostres col·laboradors, i a qui ara mateix cedeixo la paraula.
Molt bé, bon dia. Gràcies, Georgina, i gràcies al CETEM per organitzar i muntar aquesta sisena edició del Social Mobile Congress. Recordeu que neix, diguem-ne, com a reacció a un gran esdeveniment que tenim a la ciutat, el World Mobile Congress, que és el congrés de telèfons mòbils més important del món, que inunda i colonitza la nostra ciutat, o colonitzava abans de la Covid, i que es dedicava sobretot a mostrar els nous models de cara a provocar noves demandes dels consumidors, de les administracions, al voltant dels nous descobriments i noves tecnologies i noves novetats en l'àmbit dels mòbils. Hem vist també en aquests 6 anys que el mòbil ha anat prenent centralitat en les nostres vides, més que altres dispositius electrònics. I CETEM va saber aprofitar molt bé aquesta necessitat d'enfocar l'àmbit de l'electrònica no des del costat de la demanda imbuïda per una lògica capitalista, sinó de mirar-ho des de l'òptica de l'anticooperació que provoca aquesta electrònica, totes les interferències negatives que destrueixen comunitats, els àmbits naturals, la natura, la biodiversitat, les condicions de treball, una sèrie d'elements lligades a la llibertat de viure bé, de comunitats allunyades milers de quilòmetres en països com el Congo, com Bolívia, o com molts altres, o com la Xina, o com Bangladesh, lligades a l'electrònica, lligades a la cadena global de subministrament de l'electrònica, la que permet arribar al Mobile Congress i començar a anunciar models de Samsung o d'Apple. A més, aquest any li heu posat el títol Sense cobertura, que a mi em sembla una metàfora meravellosa, perquè d'alguna manera l'electrònica, pel que fa a la impactologia, pel que fa a l'anticooperació, pel que fa a l'ecologia política dels qui es queden amb els passius de l'electrònica, les externalitats negatives de l'electrònica, s'ha quedat sense cobertura i és objectiu tant del SETEM com de diferents organitzacions o cooperatives o de la xarxa Electronics Watch o de la Direcció de Justícia Global posar llum en aquesta zona sense cobertura per prendre decisions més compensades, per alertar de flagrants violacions dels drets humans i per que una capital com Barcelona, en un moment tan crític de la història en el qual la digitalització s'està accelerant de forma brutal, una capital com Barcelona que es vol dedicar a ser seu de molta d'aquesta economia globalitzada de l'electrònica. Recordeu que és la tercera ciutat d'Europa en presència de startups digitals, sí? I una sèrie de negocis lligats a l'electrònica. En aquesta aposta, que sembla que seguirà fent Barcelona, cal construir un ecosistema crític que il·lumini, que posi, que mostri aquesta zona tan important del món i tan important del futur sense cobertura. Sense cobertura en el context Covid i post-Covid. El Congrés, diguem-ne, d'enguany parla del post-Covid. Jo no l'acabo de... Jo crec que encara estem en el segon any del Covid, és un segon any distòpic totalment, i en el qual es produeix alguns elements que voldria citar per no allargar-me, però que crec que són importants. Com us deia, fixeu-vos, organitzacions de tot tipus, de les que formeu part, també administracions com l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, en pocs mesos hem hagut de passar, en el cas de Barcelona, de 200 treballadors i treballadores que tenien accés a treball digital des de casa i, per tant, que tenien el seu portàtil, a 16.000, que és la totalitat dels treballadors i treballadores de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, amb capacitats per treballar en format teletreball. No tots treballen en teletreball, òbviament, hi ha diferents casuístiques, però això ha generat una tensió interna, uns desajustos, com per exemple tenir oficines buides que tenen un cost molt elevat i una demanda d'inversió en digitalització, per exemple, amb seguretat als atacs que anem patint, o per exemple, amb artefactes com els ordinadors des del qual us parlo. Tot això és una demanda sobre l'electrònica que es fa sentir a les empreses xineses que articulen les components o a les mines de coltan del Congo, segur, perquè no és màgic l'electrònica, encara que ho sembli, ni la digitalització és màgica. Si a més afegim la voluntat de sortir de la crisi d'una economia que havia estat dissenyada d'una forma obsoleta, la Unió Europea llança un programa per 1,8 bilions d'euros que es converteix en diferents instruments com el Next EU Generation, que plega 750 milions d'euros, dels quals arribaran en forma, sobretot, de 3 grans components. Un és digitalització en diferents formes. L'altre és transició ecològica, que també vol dir electrificació, vol dir, per transició ecològica, refereixen a canviar el teu cotxe de combustible fòssil per un elèctric, el qual fa més demanda sobre el liti, sobre una sèrie de components electrònics de nou. I el tercer component, la resiliència, que també passa bastant per la digitalització. I, per tant, tota aquesta hiperpressió que es farà des d'Europa, però que es farà des de totes les ciutats del món, des de la Xina, des dels Estats Units, també amb aquest component de crisi, d'alta pressa per canviar les coses, provocarà i està provocant una pressió sobre les noves perifèries. Per tant, és objectiu nostre mostrar quines són les noves perifèries, quines són les noves cadenes globals de subministrament que impacten en el sud global, i agraeixo molt al SETEM que continuï des d'aquesta bona intuïció que té, treballant en aquesta línia i ajuntant-se amb les diferents ONGs i instituts i universitats que treballem al voltant d'aquesta pressió electrònica sense cobertura, en la part de sense cobertura. Llavors, per acabar, benvingut a aquest espai de reflexió. També dir-vos, per la part que em toca, des de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona estem treballant en aquest àmbit amb companyia d'Electronics Watch, del CETEM i d'altres organitzacions, però estem treballant de forma molt seriosa amb el tema d'aplicar la diligència deguda, que vol dir que un ajuntament, que és un gran contractista, contracti empreses que no violin drets humans a fora de les fronteres. És una cosa fàcil d'entendre, però molt difícil d'aplicar, i estem treballant amb dispositius per introduir criteris extraterritorials en la compra pública de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i fer servir Barcelona per influenciar les altres administracions. D'això la Carla Canal, que després moderarà una taula més també experta, i també amb el suport a entitats i empreses d'aquesta economia social de l'electrònica sense cobertura, de l'electrònica alternativa, de l'electrònica que es dedica a temes de sobirania digital. I en aquest sentit, també comentar-vos dues grans línies que estan també empenyent. Una és que hem introduït en la convocatòria de subvencions d'ONGs, que és el nostre instrument principal, una prioritat que és la sobirania digital i la sobirania tecnològica, perquè tot el món de les ONGs també vagi abordant els temes de digitalització, que és un tema que a vegades es desconeix, i crear i reforçar aquest ecosistema alternatiu. L'altre és un postgrau sobre drets digitals que hem impulsat a Mixnet i la Fundació Solidaritat UB, que està també a la vostra disposició per formar quadres en aquest àmbit. I finalment, un programa que estem impulsant també amb Oxfam, Mixnet, FIDOP, etc., al voltant de la justícia digital global per analitzar tota la captura democràtica que s'està produint en processos democràtics al voltant de l'ús de les xarxes socials i les interferències a través de fàbriques de vots, per exemple, que han participat en les eleccions que va guanyar Trump o Bolsonaro o el Brexit, i que són tan importants per la nostra dinàmica democràtica actual. Ahir ho vam veure a les eleccions de Madrid, també molts elements lligats a les xarxes, a les interferències de la família Bannon i d'extrema dreta, la conculcació de drets humans, que nosaltres protegirem amb ungles i dents, i amb això dir-vos endavant i molta feina per fer. Gràcies i fins la propera.
David, moltes gràcies per aquesta primera intervenció, també obertura del dia d'avui. Seguidament parlarà la presidenta de CETEM Catalunya, l'Helena Romagosa, a qui ara també cedeixo la paraula i la podrem escoltar.
Hola, bon dia. Bueno, moltes gràcies. M'ha anat molt bé que parlés abans del David perquè ja ha apuntat moltes coses que volia treure, o sigui que miraré de ser breu. Com heu dit, estem a la 6ª edició del Mobile Social Congress. Va ser al febrer del 2016, quan una quinzena d'organitzacions catalanes, com deia el David, van dir que ja n'hi havia prou. Va ser una reacció perquè representava que el Mobile World Congress ja feia anys que celebrava a Barcelona, en aquell moment ja era molt notori, vull dir, tothom parlava, tot eren bones paraules del Mobile World Congress i calia que algú, almenys públicament, comencés a dir que ja no s'estava explicant tot i que tota la indústria i tot el món electrònic que estava entrant cada dia a les nostres vides tenia una part d'injustícies que no s'estava explicant. Llavors, aquesta reacció va fer la que ens va fer el primer Mobile Social Congress, però per mi la clau, i és també com ha apuntat el David, és que des del primer moment el Mobile Social Congress es va plantejar com una denúncia, però també com una proposta d'alternatives. O sigui, no només critiquem, sinó que també proposem, i també donem visibilitat a totes aquestes alternatives que a poc i amb grans esforços es van obrint pas. O sigui, el 2016 ja vam parlar de drets laborals i de programari lliure, de l'obsolescència programada i de les iniciatives d'economia social. El 2018 ja vam introduir la mirada feminista, tota la part que les dones s'estaven enduent, a més dels greuges que ja portaven. El 2019 ja vam introduir o vam posar la mirada més concreta a la compra pública socialment responsable amb tot el tema de l'electrònica. O sigui, hem anat avançant, però vull remarcar que des del primer any es va plantejar com una denúncia, però també com una proposta d'alternatives. És una mica el que hem repassat i el que veurem entre avui i demà. Seguim ara amb l'efecte Covid, ja és el que faltava per acabar-nos de rematar, i sentirem la resistència de la gent que està a les mines del Congo i del Perú, però també els avenços amb la contractació pública. També començarem a parlar de què passa quan fem un clic, que és una cosa molt interessant, que ja fa temps que s'estan donant, ens estan arribant missatges de «Ei, cuidado», vull dir, si l'aplicació és gratuïta és que tu ets el producte. Totes aquestes coses, els algoritmes i tal, començarem a posar una mica d'ordre i a explicar realment què està passant. Ja et dic que no em vull allargar, però per mi és molt important. Demà és dia 6 de maig i demà farà un mes que va morir l'Arcadi Oliveres. L'Arcadi és un referent, segurament per molts dels que estem aquí, i potser alguns no l'heu conegut o no sabeu qui és. Us he de dir que l'Arcadi va dedicar la seva vida, va morir amb 75 anys i va dedicar tota la seva vida a denunciar i a assenyalar i a explicar totes aquesta segona part de totes les coses o de tots els entramats del capitalisme i del sistema on estem pujats al carro, i ell no va defallir. Us ho recomano, si no l'heu tingut el plaer d'escoltar, hi ha múltiples conferències penjades i té 5 o 6 llibres escrits. L'Arcadi val molt la pena escoltar-lo i tenir-lo com a referent. Per tots nosaltres segueix sent un referent i a mi encara em costa parlar d'ell en passat. L'Arcadi va col·laborar des del 1992, que col·laborava amb CETEM cada any, era una persona molt generosa i sempre deia que sí. I amb nosaltres va col·laborar amb una de les nostres activitats essencials, perquè és la nostra essència, són els camps de solidaritat. CETEM us he de dir que és una organització que té més de 50 anys de vida i que a part del mobile, que forma part de totes les nostres campanyes de sensibilització, que en tenim diverses, us convido a entrar a la web per veure-les, però a part tenim l'activitat que és el nostre cor, que és els camps de solidaritat, que són com diguéssim uns camps de treball, és tot un pla de formació i enviem catalans a diferents parts del món. Malauradament, amb la pandèmia ara estem una mica amb un impàs que no ho hem pogut fer, però segueix sent la nostra raó de ser. I l'Arcadi, una de les últimes coses que ens va dir, però ja ho havia dit molts cops, i és que no hem de perdre l'esperança, perquè l'esperança, al final, és el motor que ens fa tirar endavant per dir no pot ser, o plantar-nos i dir no, fins aquí, o buscar la manera de fer les coses d'una altra manera que sigui més respectuós, evidentment, amb les persones i amb el món on estem. I l'esperança, que és una cosa que potser sona molt buit, o d'esperança no es viu, a vegades diuen, doncs mira, l'esperança ens fa avançar. Mireu, fa unes setmanes estava sopant i al Telenotícies, a principis de març, van anunciar que entrava en vigor la llei de la Unió Europea del dret a reparar. El dret a reparar què vol dir? Doncs que són diferents clàusules basades en l'economia circular, però la principal i la més notòria és que obliguen a partir d'allà els fabricants d'electrodomèstics o d'equips electrònics, diferents rams, els obliguen a tenir durant 10 anys peces de recanvi. Per què? A quants de vosaltres no us ha passat? Vull dir, el mòbil, la torradora, la rentadora, el que sigui, se'ns espatlla i després, vull dir, potser té 3-4 anys i ja no hi ha peces de recanvi. Amb això, que potser sembla petit, però és un gran avenç. És un gran avenç que a nivell europeu hi hagi una legislació que ja obligui els fabricants. Amb això s'està lluitant contra l'obsolescència programada. I és, per exemple, una de les organitzacions, és una coalició d'organitzacions que ha lluitat més perquè s'aprovi aquesta llei, és la del Right to Repair, que CETEM hi forma part, és a nivell europeu. I després un altre avenç, per exemple, és aquest que el David ja l'ha comentat, que tant l'Ajuntament de Barcelona com la Generalitat de Catalunya estan afiliats a Electronic Watch i fan que tota l'adquisició de nous equips electrònics tinguin clàusules socials i ambientals. S'està fent un gran pas a nivell de contractació pública en aquest país per mirar que la vida segueixi, perquè al final no podem desprendre'ns de tots... Avui dia no ens podríem trobar, perquè estem tots connectats davant d'una càmera, però la vida ha de seguir, però ha de seguir d'una altra manera, d'acord? I és això el que des del 2016 amb aquest mobile i també amb altres campanyes que estem fent des de CETEM, estem intentant insistir i obrir camí i amb la contractació pública, per exemple, tenim una incidència directa perquè aquestes coses estiguin passant i ja estan passant. I al final l'esperança és per dir-vos que l'esperança porta cap a algun lloc. Vull dir que, en tot cas, no l'hem de perdre i hem de seguir insistint. L'Arcadi val molt la pena. És una persona que a CETEM ens l'estimem moltíssim, hem tingut una pèrdua molt gran i volia que estigués present també avui. M'atreveixo a dir que si l'Arcadi estigués avui aquí, doncs potser diria que hem vingut aquí a carregar-nos de raons. M'agrada aquesta idea de que estarem aquí davant de la pantalla durant 2 dies carregant-nos de raons i tant de bo així sigui. Poca cosa més, només volia agrair primer de tot a tots els que esteu aquí i els que estareu escoltant les conferències durant aquests 2 dies. Evidentment, sense tot aquest públic no tindria sentit que ho féssim. Moltes gràcies. També, evidentment, a tots els ponents que participen, a les 2 moderadores, que serà segur una meravella. Moltíssimes gràcies per la col·laboració, la bona disponibilitat i que tot surti bé entre tots. Sobretot, dins de CETEM, la Judit Talvi, la Marta Anglès i l'Ester Mira són les 3 persones tècniques directament involucrades amb aquest mobile. Això del mobile és tot l'any de feina, o sigui, noies, felicitats, espero que ho gaudiu també i n'estic segura que sortirà bé, però val molt, molt la pena tot l'esforç que heu fet durant tots aquests mesos. Per acabar, l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, evidentment, no només pel finançament que ens fa possible fer aquest mobile, però he de dir que amb en David, perdona David que et tutegi, amb el David Llistà i la Carla Canal, que és la tècnica i moderarà una taula després, hem tingut un diàleg. Vull dir, no es tracta només de presentar una subvenció, m'agrada el projecte, compleixes les bases i t'atorguem el finançament. No es tracta d'això, sinó que hi ha un diàleg i hi ha una implicació des de les administracions públiques que això ens ajuda molt en la nostra feina, però també ens dona moltes esperances, perquè al final qui estigui a l'administració pública ha de ser algú que administri els nostres diners, però que també tingui aquest compromís i aquesta implicació. I vull fer explícit aquest agraïment, sobretot amb ells 2 i a tot l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, perquè ens està tirant endavant amb una qualitat molt notable. I, evidentment, també a la coalició de Good Electronics, que ja ho heu dit, que ens ha ajudat a organitzar en concret el mobile, però durant tot l'any també hi col·laborem. I, finalment, a totes les sòcies i socis de CETEM que mantenen l'entitat, malgrat els temps que estem tenint, i que ens ajuden a mantenir aquesta estructura per poder fer totes aquestes activitats que crec que sumen. Crec que més o menys no m'he deixat res. Moltes gràcies per donar-me aquests minuts per presentar-vos. És un honor presidir CETEM i és un orgull veure tot el que passarà aquests 2 dies. Moltes gràcies i que vagi molt bé.
Helena, moltes gràcies. Fent esment a l'Arcadi Oliveres, i tant que sí, un referent per aquesta organització, però també per molt i molta gent que segur que ara el tenen certament present. I també gràcies al David. Abans d'entrar en matèria, presentar-vos aquest primer panell d'aquest congrés. Saludem a les persones que ens estan seguint per streaming a través del web del Mobile Social Congress o també del canal de YouTube de CETEM Catalunya, que també podeu seguir-nos a través d'allà. T'aprofito també per recordar-vos que podeu fer-ne seguiment per la resta de xarxes socials de CETEM amb els hashtags Mobile Social Congress 2021 i MSC 2021. Al nostre web també trobareu més informació al mobilesocialcongress.cat. Aquest any el nostre mobile s'ha dividit en dos formats diferents, tant en proposta com en calendari. Hem dit que són condicions també excepcionals, per tant el mobile també ho ha de ser. D'una banda, aquesta primera part virtual que encetem avui, dia 5, i d'altra, una segona part presencial que tindrà lloc als espais oberts de la ciutat de Barcelona i es farà del 27 al 29 de juny amb activitats obertes a tota la ciutadania. Moment de recordatori de nou, pels que heu entrat tard, que la sessió ara mateix està sent gravada i us demanem que mantingueu els micròfons en silenci. Si teniu preguntes, dirigir-les directament al xat des d'on les anirem recollint, i us recordem que també disposem d'un sistema d'interpretació simultània, anglès-espanyol, espanyol-anglès, també el català. Per accedir a la traducció de l'idioma que es desitja, només heu de connectar el canal en l'idioma que preferiu escoltar. Bé, doncs arriba el moment, engeguem aquest primer debat d'aquesta primera jornada amb el que hem volgut titular com Veus de resistència a les mines en temps de Covid. Veurem casos de la República Democràtica del Congo i el Perú, i on parlarem també de mineria responsable. En aquest cas, el diàleg serà moderat per Octavio Romano, que és membre de l'organització amiga Alboan. L'Octavio ha treballat per al Comitè Espanyol d'ACNUR, ara és tècnic per a l'Àfrica en l'ONG Alboan a Pamplona, i és guionista del curtmetratge Torners, que tracta la connexió entre el nostre consum de tecnologia i el conflicte en les mines de coltan a la República Democràtica del Congo. I ara mateix cedeixo la paraula.
Gracias, Georgina. Buen día. Antes que nada, bueno, creo que se me escucha bien. Agradecer a CETEM la oportunidad de poder moderar este debate. Creo que hay dos paneles que muestran dos experiencias duras de denuncia y que se deben denunciar, y otra que nos trae Rebeca desde IRMA, que muestra una luz, ¿no? Una esperanza sobre cómo controlar esto que está pasando y los desmanes de muchas empresas, y también ver cómo se puede atraer la voluntad de muchas empresas hacia un modelo de diligencia de vida en el ejercicio de sus actividades extractivas, ¿no? Decir que en el orden de los paneles va a ser alterado. El primer panelista, que era Manuel Umpula, pues ha tenido un problema con sus vuelos, y será finalmente, estará Manuel en tercer lugar, con lo cual empezaremos con el panel que nos llega desde Perú, con la experiencia del Espinar, criminalización de personas defensoras de derechos y la situación de contaminación y enfermedades provocadas por la extracción de metales tóxicos, que nos traen desde la organización Derechos Humanos Sin Fronteras, como digo, del país andino, Karen Luque y Elio Cruz. Voy a comenzar presentando a ambos panelistas. Karen Luque es especialista en salud pública en esta organización, en Derechos Humanos Sin Fronteras. Trabaja como coordinadora nacional de la Mesa Técnica de Salud Ambiental y Humana en Perú, que es un espacio de concertación, incidencia y de apoyo a personas que sufren enfermedades por motivo de esta extracción de metales tóxicos de forma irracional o no controlada en varias zonas del país. Y Elio Cruz también trabaja con Karen en Derechos Humanos Sin Fronteras en Perú, es activista en derechos humanos, y nos va a traer los testimonios de en el contexto del conflicto que se produjo en el Espinar, pues bueno, las denuncias sobre la criminalización de muchos de los manifestantes que salieron a la calle a denunciar la situación, no quiero hacer spoiler, y bueno, nos va a traer un poco la mirada desde la denuncia de todo cuanto ocurrió allí y las violaciones de derechos humanos que se produjeron por parte de las autoridades. Creo que tenéis un pequeño vídeo preparado. Comienzas tú, Elio. Recordaros, tanto a Elio como a Karen, tenéis 10 minutos cada uno y os seguimos avisando de cómo van los tiempos. ¿De acuerdo? Así que adelante, Elio, te doy la palabra cuando quieras.
Octavio, muy buenos días y muy buenos días a todos quienes están en esta importante actividad. Bueno, lo primero que tenemos que hacer es la presentación de este video que resume una serie de afectaciones que sufren los defensoras del medio ambiente y el territorio en la provincia de Espinar. Espinar se encuentra en el departamento de Cusco, en el Perú, en donde se desarrolla la actividad minera por parte de la compañía minera Antapacay. Así que este video resume en síntesis una serie de afectaciones principalmente relacionadas a la criminalización que sufren hermanos, hermanas en esta provincia, y en segundo lugar, sobre los efectos de la criminalización, cómo sienten ellos la criminalización en estos años. Así que, por favor, si podrían presentar el video, no dura mucho tiempo, tiene como 2 minutos para poder, a partir del video, empezar a desarrollar y desenvolver todos los efectos y problemas que han surgido en Espinar.
En primera persona puedo decir que hemos sido atentados por la policía, hemos sufrido torturas juntamente con muchos jóvenes y señoritas, madres de familia, padres de familia, abuelitos. Aquí en la provincia de Espinar también han habido muertes y han sido años atrás, ¿no? Y nunca se ha llegado a esclarecer ese caso. Pero sí, ¿no? La policía se viene en contra de los dirigentes, a ellos sí los investigan por años, pero no se investiga a la policía que causa ese tipo de represión, que causa ese tipo de muertes, lamentablemente.
La detención en la municipalidad ha sido violenta. En esas circunstancias que me detienen de manera arbitraria, de manera violenta, y bueno, me llevan al campamento minero, donde la policía, los fiscales se habían instalado prácticamente a modo de un cuartel, ¿no? Esta firma de convenio que habían institucionalizado entre el gobierno representado por el Ministerio del Interior con las empresas mineras para que la policía se ponga al servicio de las empresas mineras.
Para nosotros, pues, penas de cárcel de 7 años, 8 años por cada delito, ¿no? Y una reparación de casi 5 millones de soles, ¿no? Hay comunidades campesinas que están afectados con metales pesados. Hasta ahorita, el gobierno, ¿qué está haciendo? Nada.
Si dicen que hemos cometido delitos, que también juzguen todas las atrocidades y delitos que está cometiendo la empresa.
Esperemos que no haya una sentencia que pueda, en cierta medida, limitarnos a nuestras posibilidades de derecho.
Creemos que este proceso tiene que terminar en una absolución para nosotros, ¿no? Porque no hemos cometido los delitos que dicen que hemos cometido.
Social móvil por un modelo electrónico justo en esta 6ª edición, debemos decir lo siguiente. Primero, que en los últimos 40 años se habita en medio de la explotación minera en la provincia de Espinar. Los últimos 40 años reflejan una serie de acciones de explotación minera y paralelamente una serie de afectaciones a derechos colectivos, individuales, que tienen las propias comunidades indígenas originarias en la provincia de Espinar. La compañía minera Antapacay, la empresa de propiedad de la empresa suiza Glencore, extrae principalmente concentrados de cobre y ha operado con normalidad dentro de la pandemia. En el año 2020, hasta el mes de julio, se reportaron oficialmente trabajadores contagiados por COVID-19, ello porque se ha denunciado públicamente y pues la empresa minera ha ocultado los protocolos internos hacia la población, los protocolos internos sobre COVID-19. Hasta la fecha se entiende que hay un más y ha habido denuncia de los propios trabajadores de la empresa minera respecto de las actuaciones que tuvo la empresa en relación al manejo o administración del COVID-19. La pandemia afecta a familias de Espinar, por ello en el mes de mayo solicitan que se otorgue un bono solidario de 1,000 soles, que serían como $260, y esto fue aprobado por el Comité de Gestión del Convenio Marco. El Convenio Marco es un acuerdo suscrito desde el año 2003 y funciona con el aporte anual del 3% de las utilidades del proyecto minero. La finalidad de este aporte es aprobar, financiar proyectos productivos y sociales en la provincia de Espinar. Sin embargo, la empresa minera se opuso a desembolsar el dinero. Desde entonces, poco a poco se fue generando un escenario de conflictividad. Eso porque la población en general entendía que este presupuesto, que este aporte del convenio marco estaba disponible para poder utilizarlos, y más aún en esta situación de emergencia, no solo sanitaria, sino emergencia económica por la que atraviesan las familias en la provincia de Espinar. Esta provincia, luego de reiterados espacios de diálogo, cacerolazos nocturnos, movilizaciones, pronunciamientos, finalmente dio inicio a una huelga indefinida que terminó con la represión de las Fuerzas Armadas y la policía en el mes de julio del año pasado. Y esta represión fue sobre la población movilizada, resultando así al menos 3 personas heridas de bala y decenas de heridos por impactos de perdigones y otras agresiones físicas que al día de hoy se encuentran en proceso de recuperación. Nuevamente, el Estado ejerce la criminalización como instrumento de solución de conflictos generada por la misma empresa minera. El 22 de julio del año pasado tenemos registrado 3 escenarios de criminalización. El primer escenario en el centro poblado de Tintaya, Tintaya Marquiri, cerca de la explotación minera. La policía utiliza sus armas y dispara contra los manifestantes, sin justificación alguna que ponga en riesgo grave e inminente sus vidas. Luego, la policía ha negado el uso de armas letales durante la protesta. Sin embargo, se encontró en la zona casquillos de bala con inscripciones Policía Nacional del Perú y haberse registrado heridos atendidos en el hospital de Espinar. El segundo escenario, en un camión de cerca de 30 personas, entre adolescentes, menores de edad, mujeres, varones y adultos, se dirigen de retorno a Espinar, pero a la altura del ingreso a la ciudad de Espinar, el camión fue obligado a detenerse mediante disparos ejecutados por efectivos de la policía. Los ocupantes del camión, bajo insultos y amenazas de muerte, fueron golpeados y obligados a estar boca abajo sobre la carretera. Estas personas denunciaron incluso que fueron rociados con combustible con amenaza de prenderles fuego. Denunciaron tocamientos indebidos varias de las jóvenes presentes en esta intervención. Los arrestados fueron abandonados en esta zona en donde se encontraba. El tercer escenario, la policía ingresa a la ciudad de Espinar y para llegar a la comisaría, a su paso golpearon a personas e invadieron propiedad privada, viviendas de Espinar. Asimismo, un joven fue herido con múltiples lesiones en el cuero cabelludo, en el rostro, manos, en el hombro izquierdo, personas heridas por perdigones en el cuerpo, impactos de bomba lacrimógena sobre viviendas afectando la salud de niñas, niños, ancianos que atemorizados no podían salir de sus viviendas. Además, se registró denuncias de desapariciones. Es que muchas personas no podían retornar a casa aquella noche por temor a encontrarse con la policía y ser agredidos. Ahora, junto a la explotación minera en Espinar, en paralelo se tiene impactos reales e identificados. Esos impactos son a la salud, al territorio con el desplazamiento de las familias, de comunidades campesinas, asimismo, el encarecimiento del costo de vida, el fracaso completo de la producción agropecuaria, producto de la contaminación ambiental, además de la constante persecución judicial a defensoras, defensores que son líderes en la provincia de Espinar, quienes son sometidos a investigaciones por parte de la Fiscalía y estigmatizados por medios de comunicación, radio, televisión, redes sociales, que tienen financiamiento publicitario de la empresa minera. La Fiscalía, en la investigación, no tienen una sola prueba de las imputaciones que hace. Aún así, los llevan a juicio para anular las acciones de reivindicación que demandan o denuncian los defensores y defensoras de la provincia de Espinar. Así también afecta a este conflicto la suscripción de convenios específicos entre la empresa minera y la Policía Nacional, quienes mediante un pago, es decir, la empresa minera hace un pago, un depósito a la policía para que les pueda brindar seguridad privada y actúan con completa impunidad contra defensoras y defensores que provienen de comunidades campesinas que protestan, que demandan, que denuncian dos cosas: la contaminación ambiental y la falta de cumplimiento de acuerdos en el marco de su responsabilidad social ambiental. La criminalización está dirigida contra defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos, pues tiene objetivos concretos, entre los cuales es evitar los niveles de participación ciudadana, hacer consulta previa, fiscalización ambiental, monitoreo ambiental comunitario, acceso a la información, derecho a gozar de beneficios, reparación de daños ambientales, entre otros. Las principales acciones que deben implementar las empresas extractivas en el Estado sobre territorios de pueblos originarios indígenas deben ser, por ejemplo, actuar garantizando la plena vigencia del convenio 169 de la OIT, participación en los beneficios de la empresa minera, la consulta previa, el consentimiento y la reparación de daños que son importantes, evitar el uso de agentes infiltrados, que constituye una práctica sumamente invasiva que conlleva a un elevado riesgo de violación de derechos. Infiltrados son aquellas personas de la policía que están dentro de la movilización social y generan una serie de caos dentro de la misma protesta. Transparentar la inversión del presupuesto del convenio marco y ejecutar proyectos productivos y sociales.
Sí, Elio, vamos terminando.
Sí, vale. Solamente dame 10 segundos.
De acuerdo.
Transparentar la inversión del presupuesto del convenio marco y ejecutar proyectos productivos y sociales en forma autónoma, iniciar espacios de diálogo antes de los conflictos socioambientales para proteger la salud de las personas y obtener resultados orientados a la calidad ambiental y la calidad de vida. Eso podríamos poner como primeros argumentos dentro de esta primera intervención.
De acuerdo, gracias Elio por tenerte al tiempo disponible. Decir que después de los tres paneles pues dejaremos un tiempo para el debate, las preguntas y si cabe la discusión. Pasamos a dar la bienvenida a Karen Luque. He dejado antes el dato de que Karen es una mujer quechua, se define como ecofeminista y una gran defensora ambiental. Así que lo dejamos de momento a Elio y pasamos a la intervención de Karen. Karen, bienvenida.
Muchas gracias, Octavio. Saludar también a todas las personas que se han conectado a este evento que se está organizando. Un saludo también a todos los organizadores de este Congreso Social Móvil por un modelo electrónico justo, quienes también en esta 6ª edición van a dar a conocer algunas problemáticas que se han podido dar por el uso y consumo de los productos electrónicos. Yo no voy a profundizar mucho en lo que ha mencionado mi compañero Elio, ya que, como lo mencionaste, nosotros venimos acompañando desde hace varios años poblaciones con bastantes problemáticas, como ya las ha ido manifestando mi compañero Elio. Mucho se habla de las formas en cómo se ha exigido derechos en Espinar hasta ahora, pero pocas veces se ha visto el trasfondo de todos estos problemas. Yo quiero mencionarles de que estos problemas o estos conflictos sociales donde ha habido esta represión ambiental, donde ha habido esta represión policial, donde ha habido esta represión por las Fuerzas Armadas de nuestro país, han sido en realidad en la búsqueda de derechos fundamentales. ¿Acaso las poblaciones como Espinar, donde son el gran motivo del desarrollo en nuestro país, no tendrían por qué tener un acceso a la salud, un acceso al agua de calidad, un acceso a un ambiente sano, un acceso en general al desarrollo que les han prometido desde que llegaron las actividades extractivas? Lanzo esa pregunta en general porque creo que son derechos que todo ciudadano o ciudadana en cualquier parte del mundo los tiene. Inclusive hablamos en nuestro país ahora mucho sobre ese tema de quiénes tienen o no tienen acceso en un contexto inclusive político. No me voy a centrar en este contexto electoral en el que estamos ahora, sin embargo yo quiero hacer visible estos impactos que se han ido mencionando. ¿Por qué ocurren las protestas en Espinar? ¿Por qué el año pasado, durante una pandemia en la cual todos sufríamos las pérdidas de familiares, todos sufríamos con la incertidumbre de contagiarnos, con esos problemas referidos a la COVID-19, ¿por qué además de todo eso teníamos que estar pensando en factores económicos? Nuestro país ha sido uno de los más golpeados en ese sentido. Un 70% a más de nuestra población vivía con problemas de informalidad. Y eso no fue ajeno en una provincia o en una zona como lo es Espinar. Espinar, que de hace casi 40 años viene conviviendo con una empresa minera que es Glencore Antapacay. Efectivamente, Glencore no está desde hace 40 años, desde sus inicios, porque antes las empresas aquí fueron de manera pública. Sin embargo, en los últimos años esto se ha ido agravando, porque si antes las poblaciones indican de que había una cierta convivencia, porque había un cierto diálogo y ciertos acuerdos que se daban, los impactos han ido siendo más visibles con el pasar de los años. Y al hablar de impactos, yo me voy a referir a que empiezan los primeros problemas ambientales ya en el año 2005, ya en el año 2012. O sea, estamos hablando de hace 9 años atrás, donde ya Glencore, donde ya Antapacay sabían estas problemáticas. Y centrándonos específicamente en los problemas ambientales y de salud, bueno, pues las poblaciones allá vienen exigiendo derechos, como ya les mencionaba, que son derechos fundamentales. Han tenido que pasar más de 6 años en nuestro país y principalmente con las poblaciones de Espinar para que el Estado les dé una respuesta en cuanto a sus atenciones de salud, para darles la razón en que realmente estas personas están viviendo con tóxicos en sus organismos. ¿Se imaginan ustedes que además de tener presencia de metales tóxicos que te pueda dar la COVID-19, para ellos ha sido un momento de incertidumbre, porque además acudir a un centro de salud cercano era muy inviable? No tenías tú una posta con buenos médicos o con el suficiente personal. En algunos casos ni siquiera hay médicos en estas zonas. Ellos cuentan con un tipo de hospital que no se abastece y que finalmente no termina atendiendo sus problemas desde hace muchos años. En esta demanda o en este proceso judicial del que les hablo, acompañamos desde nuestra institución, también Derechos Humanos Sin Fronteras, junto a otras instituciones, a generar un proceso de demanda para garantizar el derecho a la salud. 6 años después, el Ministerio de Salud, que es el ente rector de garantizar este derecho en nuestro país, apela judicialmente para decir de que ellos no están todavía en la capacidad de poder atender estos problemas. Una serie más de compromisos que no son asumidos como garantes de derecho desde nuestro país. Actualmente nosotros tenemos una data que fue registrada a partir de información de gobierno de que son más de 1.621 personas que tienen registros con presencia de más de un mineral en el organismo. No estoy hablando de que tengan minerales que para las personas en cierto grado pueden ser normales. No estoy hablando de tener fósforo, de tener calcio o de tener quizás en algunos casos también materiales o elementos esenciales. Estoy hablando de elementos que no debieran estar en el organismo. Y esos elementos son el arsénico, el cadmio, mercurio, plomo. ahí hay una gran deficiencia por reconocer quién está ocasionando estos problemas de salud en las personas. Si bien hasta ahora no se demuestra la real relación científica que pueda determinar este problema de salud y su presencia en las personas, eso no quiere decir que eso no exista. Existe desde hace muchísimos años y se ha ido agravando con los años, porque el funcionamiento y la forma de vida de un metal tóxico no es inmediato, no es como lo hemos podido manifestar con un síntoma durante la COVID-19. Estos problemas o estos tóxicos se van acumulando en el organismo y generando un deterioro de órganos, hígado, cerebro, corazón, estómago, entre otros que son esenciales para nosotros y por lo tanto van a ir provocando males de aquí a 2, 3 a 4 años.
Discúlpame, Karen, discúlpame, tienes 3 minutos, ¿de acuerdo?
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Entonces, ¿por qué nosotros relacionamos y por qué las personas relacionan aún sin tener toda la información o la evidencia científica que hasta ahora no la puede determinar nuestro país? Porque simplemente creemos que hay formas en las cuales no se pretende transparentar la información. Así como llegaron a sus territorios y les dijeron que iban a tener desarrollo, que iban a tener mejores condiciones económicas, educativas, de salud, no les han comentado y no les han dicho la verdad sobre los efectos adversos que iban a tener por estar en contacto con actividades extractivas, entre ellas la extracción de minerales. Ahí muchas veces nos han preguntado, ¿y cómo es que ustedes pueden asociar externamente la presencia de metales en el organismo de las personas asociado a los proyectos mineros si pueden darse de manera natural? Eso lo van a escuchar en muchos otros espacios. Pues bien, yo ahí les comento algo rapidísimo. Si estás en un territorio donde el mineral efectivamente está presente y empiezas a extraer ese mineral que debiera degradarse en 1000, 2000, hasta 3000 años por procesos naturales o debiera permanecer en la corteza terrestre de esa forma, tú vienes con unas máquinas, empiezas a generar la extracción, ¿acaso no vas a hacer que ese mineral salga mucho más antes de la corteza y pueda juntarse con aguas de las cuales la población se abastece? Ese tipo de explicaciones todavía no la terminan de transparentar en nuestro país, y principalmente en el caso de Espinar. Los efectos, como lo iba resaltando, ya han ido deteriorándose con los años. Tenemos personas que ya han manifestado, por más de que no se esté teniendo un registro viable, confiable en nuestro país y principalmente en Espinar, son personas que ya han manifestado desde hace 3, 4, 5 años atrás mayor presencia de personas con malformaciones congénitas, presencia de mujeres que tienen abortos que no son normales, niños y niñas que ya tienen problemas de anemia, pero no por ausencia de hierro, sino por exceso de plomo. Tenemos personas que ya han denunciado un montón de veces daños en su salud y no es un tema que solamente compete a el Ministerio de Salud. Creemos que si no tienen un ambiente sano, es eso lo que está acarreando todo este cúmulo de enfermedades. Entonces, para cerrar la idea, porque ya se culminó mi tiempo, solamente quería mencionarles de que para nosotros no se pueden tener o no se puede hablar de desarrollo cuando hay zonas de sacrificio. Y estas zonas de sacrificio implica que estas generaciones van a seguir teniendo un problema gravísimo a su salud durante los próximos años. Mayor control en el consumo de los aparatos electrónicos y mayor conciencia también para saber de dónde están llegando estos productos y exigir que se respeten los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Karen. Gracias por también respetar los tiempos. A ver si tenemos luego tiempo para hacerte algunas preguntas, porque es un tema también muy triste y que remueve mucho. Pasamos al siguiente panel. Vamos a hablar de Irma y vamos a hablar de Irma con Rebeca Barton. Rebeca es directora de comunicaciones y compromiso corporativo en Irma, que es Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. Y bueno, desde hace 2006 Irma está trabajando en un modo de de certificar una minería responsable desde la propia iniciativa privada, ¿no? Rebeca es experta en sostenibilidad, responsabilidad corporativa y filantropía desde hace más de 10 años y bueno, es una firme defensora y cree en el potencial del sector privado para promover un cambio a mejor en las prácticas empresariales responsables y en concreto en la industria extractiva. Rebeca nos va a tratar de acercar la posibilidad de que desde el sector privado se pueda construir un sistema de certificación, de diligencia de vida de las industrias extractivas que sea creíble en un contexto en el que bueno, pues estamos asistiendo a legislaciones nacionales o internacionales como la Dodd-Frank en Estados Unidos o la recientemente operativa legislación europea sobre minerales en conflicto, ¿no? Que bueno, están en discusión. No te gasto más tiempo, Rebeca, tienes aproximadamente 15 minutos, bienvenida y el panel es tuyo. Adelante.
Thank you so much, Octavio, and thank you so much to Karen and Elio. I so appreciate you being here and to present so bravely and courageously what's happening in your country. And yes, while sobering and so touching, I just thank you so much for sharing it with us. It's something, it's a topic and a reality that I think is so important to set the stage for the broader discussion. And I also just want to say thank you especially for
doy las gracias también a los que han tenido que levantarse tan pronto para estar con nosotros esta mañana. Hablando de esta iniciativa, voy a compartir mi pantalla con ustedes porque algunas transparencias les van a ser de gran ayuda. Esta iniciativa de aseguramiento de transparencia y gobernanza justa me sirve para ahondar en lo que han hablado Karen y Elio. En primer lugar, os voy a hablar de lo que es IRMA y cómo nos diferenciamos de otros en la certificación de minas, y también hablaré al final de cómo hemos respondido al COVID en cuanto al sistema de certificación. IRMA es un sistema de certificación voluntario, es una forma que podemos abordar algunos de los problemas de los que hemos oído hablar. Certificamos las minas en contra de los estándares. Hay dos partes. La primera son los estándares, una serie de requisitos para medir una mina. Tenemos requerimientos sobre 26 diferentes temas. Y aquí los listo. La idea es que IRMA tiene 26 capítulos y cada uno de esos apartados pues tiene varios requerimientos específicos. Según los temas, hay 400 requerimientos que le pedimos a una mina, a una extracción minera, que reúna para responder también ante la sociedad. Ven aquí estos apartados que son unos estándares que abordan varios de los temas que hemos escuchado hoy cuanto a la responsabilidad social, ambiental. La idea es que los estándares deben cubrir todos los elementos, todos los temas que se abordan en las minas. No queremos enfatizar la gestión del agua sobre la biodiversidad o los derechos. Entendemos que estos estándares deben incluir todos los problemas, todas las cuestiones relacionadas con la mina. La idea es también que cada uno de estos requisitos dentro de estos apartados son muy específicos y definidos. Quiere decir que cuando hablamos de 400 requerimientos es muy específico. Cuando hablamos de tener un plan de accionariado pues muy comprometido, por ejemplo, quiere decir que este plan debe ser inclusivo en un idioma que se entienda, debe ser apropiado para los grupos más vulnerables. Y los requerimientos de los que hablamos para entender estas prácticas responsables están muy detallados y son muy descriptivos. Y hablamos high bar y rigorous, un estándar, porque responde a unas expectativas muy específicas de cómo hay que llevar a cabo una extracción minera. No hemos empezado de la nada. Lo hemos hecho a partir de esfuerzos de muy largo plazo con organizaciones que trabajan sobre estos temas. La idea es que es la naturaleza integral de las minas y de esta actividad. Nos hemos basado en los trabajos de OECD, las guías de diligencia de vida, los principios guía de Naciones Unidas. ¿Y cómo lo hemos desarrollado? Bueno, se desarrolló a través de un proceso multi-stakeholder con las diferentes participantes. Hay 5 actores principales aquí. Creemos que es muy importante concentrarse en esto y subrayarlo porque es único en cuanto a la fundación de IRMA en 2006. Sigue siendo un modelo único en cuanto a la certificación minera. Es el único sistema de certificación minera integral que incluye las voces de todas las partes afectadas. No es un estándar de la industria, no es lo que hace la mina frente a cómo debería comportarse, sino todos los grupos trabajando juntos para establecer los estándares sobre lo que representa pues llevar a cabo una extracción minera de forma responsable. Sobre estos 400 requerimientos, ahora presentaré cada una de las organizaciones que habéis visto también para asegurarnos.
We remain accountable to each of these sectors. So mining is at the table to ensure that the standard is practicable and can be realized on the ground. And NGOs, labor, affected communities are so critical in terms of ensuring that we actually move beyond the status quo, that we actually make a change in mining that needs to happen. And the other important point that I'll make here, you can see that it's multi-stakeholder governance and each sector has the same voting rights. And it's not just majority, so let's say that there's a decision to make. For example, when we had the final version of the standard, everyone needed to vote, yes, we're ready to release the standard. And if there's any of these, we call them houses, any of these stakeholders that say, no, we're not ready to release the standard, or no, we're not ready to move on that vote, it's not that the other 4 can outnumber them. They actually have to go back to the table until there's a yes vote from each sector. And so I think that's really important in terms of the governance model. So the other part of IRMA and the certification system is third-party assurance. So this is meaning, sorry, let me just find my notes. So the idea is that you bring in a third party and independent auditor to actually look at a mine's performance against the standard that I've been talking about. And one really important aspect that also sets IRMA apart is the fact that communities, NGOs, and mine workers are engaged in that audit process. So what do I mean by that? First, we actually publicly notice, we put on our website that an audit is going to occur, but we don't just expect that NGOs or communities will be monitoring our website by any means. We do proactive outreach to say, in your area, there's going to be an audit. We want you to be aware of it. We want you to understand what IRMA is, and we would like you to participate in the audit. So when the auditor goes on site for the audit process, they actually interview off-site the communities that are neighboring the mine, NGOs that are working in the area, And then they also do independent interviews with labor. So that's a very key aspect, again, that is different from other certification systems. When the report comes out, it's free and available. I'll speak about the report and show you some examples of what's in it, but that's a really important aspect as well. You don't have to be a member of IRMA to access it. You don't have to pay to access it. You don't even have to log in. You just go to the website and you can see how the mine has performed against the standard. And then finally, we do outreach to communities after the audit report is out to ensure they know it's there, to ensure they understand what's the findings. And so I just want to give you an example when I speak about the audit report, because that's ultimately one of the main sort of, I would say, outputs that IRMA provides is the audit report. So in the report, you find many different things in terms of location of the mine, specifications of where they operate. You also will find how the audit was conducted, which includes a list, for example, of all of the communities that were interviewed. You can see here groups of different representatives from communities that were interviewed, 120 people total. And then you see also additional interviews that actually happened at local health clinics and with governments. And so you see all of that in the audit report. You know who has spoken and you know whose voices have been heard. And then coming back to those 26 chapters that I spoke about, you actually see how a mine has performed against each and every chapter. You see this as an overview, and then you actually see the report is about 100 pages. So you see in those 100 pages, requirement by requirement, you see first the requirement on the left side. The middle is saying in yellow, they partially met the requirement, blue substantially met, and green means they met it, they met the requirement. And then on the right side, you actually see the auditor's reasoning for why they gave that score. And so it's all there, all clear, with evidence for why that score was given. And so in terms of the score, I won't go into this too much, but basically what happens is that the mine receives a score from 1 to 100. And in order to achieve what we call a score in IRMA, whether 50, 75, or 100, the mine actually has to meet a set of what we call critical requirements. So these things are we call them critical. There's 40 critical requirements in IRMA out of the 400 that we just feel if we're going to give a mine a score and say you've achieved a certain level, that at least they must meet these minimum requirements, such as compliance with host country laws, workers' freedom of association, no river or lake disposal of mine waste, for example. Those are just examples of some of the 40 that are there. And so the idea here is that a mine scores from 1 to 100, and then by showing that score in a transparent way, there can actually be continuous improvement over time. You can see how did they score on their first mine audit, and then 3 years later when they're re-audited, how are they improving? So I just want to sort of wrap up on IRMA, and then Octavio, I'm not sure, maybe you can tell me how many more minutes I have. I can see you there on my screen.
We got 3-4 minutes left. Yeah.
That's perfect. So I'll just speak very quickly to how we managed in COVID then. So this is just to say in terms of certification, actually I want to jump because I do think there's one more slide I want to show before I talk about COVID, which is this, which is to say, so IRMA, we were started in 2006, but it took us 10 years to actually create the standard because that was collaboration between those 5 stakeholder groups coming together. So we actually started certifying at the end of 2019. And at the beginning of 2020, I think it's important to note that we had 3 mining companies engaged in the IRMA system, meaning that they were using the self-assessment tool. Now we have 30. So just over the course of a year and there's been a 10-fold increase. And why has that happened? There was a question actually from one of the organizers when we prepared for this session. Why would a mine want to be measured against such a high bar standard and be so transparent about it? Well, the truth is, the request is coming from companies who buy those mined materials. So members such as Daimler, BMW, Microsoft, Tiffany are at the table saying, we want more insight into our supply chain. Why are they asking that? Well, I think it's really important in this forum that I emphasize one of the reasons that companies are asking for mines to be certified is because those companies are getting the requests from civil society, from activists, from NGOs, from all of you. They want to understand what's happening at the community level. And so I just really want to emphasize that in this venue, how important your voices are in raising the issues of what's happening, and that companies are taking that, certain companies are taking that seriously and saying, we want to know what's going on in our supply chain. And by asking mining companies to engage, that's what's causing mining companies to actually come into the system. And I'll just speak very quickly on our COVID response, that we did have a specific response. It really prioritized keeping communities, workers, auditors safe, while still understanding that we needed to have monitoring of mines going on. To be honest, I think things generally slowed. So in fact, we had the option for remote auditing, but we never actually tested it last year. We have 2 audit reports that came out last year, but they were both audited before COVID. So the on-site happened before the pandemic. And then I'll just close by saying that we have heard from mining companies themselves that the standard and the different requirements that we have laid out in terms of community health, the mining companies have said, if a mining company followed all of those requirements, they actually would have been prepared for COVID. So there's actually already in place requirements that would have addressed the pandemic. So I'll close there, and thank you so much for the time.
Gracias. Thanks a lot, Rebecca. A ver si tenemos luego tiempo para preguntas. Veo que hay alguna mano levantada. Si os pediría que esperásemos al último panel y después hacemos un turno de preguntas. Lamentablemente no tenemos a Emmanuel, ya nos había dicho que andaría justo con los cambios de vuelos. Vamos a intentar que, bueno, pues, con mucha previsión, Emmanuel, viendo que a lo mejor no podría estar, nos envió un vídeo de 5 minutos. Os adelanto, Emmanuel Umpula es director ejecutivo de African Resource Watch, una ONG que se encarga de, pues, bueno, de ser una plataforma de vigilancia y de observación y de incidencia política sobre los temas relacionados con violaciones de derechos humanos en contextos extractivos en la República Democrática del Congo. El panel de Manuel versaba sobre el último informe de AfriWatch de febrero de 2021 relativo a las violaciones de derechos humanos y laborales cometidos por 13 empresas mineras en las provincias de Alto Katanga y de Lualaba, en el este del Congo. Es un informe demoledor que os recomiendo que busquéis y si la organización os puede compartir, os será de gran utilidad, porque es demoledor sobre el impacto y las medidas que realizaron algunas empresas en en los meses de confinamiento en estos sitios mineros. Bueno, como os digo, lamentablemente Manuel no está, pero damos paso al vídeo de 5 minutos que nos ha preparado. Adelante.
Okay, so I'm sorry for not being with you today because my plane was delayed. So my name is Emmanuel Umpula. I work for African Resource Watch. We are based in Congo, Kinshasa. So today I will share with you about the impact of COVID-19 in Congolese mining sector. So we are talking about copper and cobalt. When the COVID-19 started in Congo, the state took the decision to shut everything down. So this also concerned the mining sector. So when we talk about mining sector, we talk about industrial mining and natural mining. So I will start with industrial and then artisanal. First of all, you should know that the number of cases in Congo, it's about 30,000 cases. and around 26,000 people have been healing, and we have about 700 cases of death in Congo. So I think what we can say, the impact was not in terms of cases, it was not huge. So we are lucky for that as a country. But at the same time, if we try to see the mining sector itself, so we have cases where everything was shut down. So people in the industrial mining, they lost their job, they lost the income, and people was fired without getting their payment. And also people was confined in the mining sites without the right to see their families for 6 months for some of them. And you know that is a human rights violation to refuse for a worker to see his family. So yeah, so that kind of cases impact or human rights violation we noticed in Congo. And also for the artisanal mining, that was very bad because everything was closed. People was not confined, so everything was closed. The other miners lose their job, they couldn't sell their minerals, so buyers was not there, they went back to their country. And so women were also impacted, really impacted, because particularly widows who doesn't have any means, so they just work as artisanal miners washing minerals. So at that time they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. So they couldn't send their have food for their kids, even treat them when they are sick. So the impact was very huge for widows. Yeah. So of course, at the same time, if we try to see about the production of minerals, the number go up, so they produce more than the last year. So you are in the case where people are suffering, but at the same time, mining companies are producing more. So that's the case. So at the same time, they are producing more and they are paying people less because the salary was, they cut salaries of workers. And also, to finish my presentation, the state doesn't do anything to support people who lost their jobs, even in terms of economic support or money support. They didn't get anything. Even people who tried to go to court, they didn't get any success because the state, the idea was we need to support business during this bad time, pandemic time. So that's a short what I would like to share with you. I'm very sorry because I can't be with you as my plan was changed, but I will send you a presentation. Thank you very much.
Para el rato del debate. ¿Sí? Ahora. Bueno, comenzamos. Si de aquí a tenemos 6-7 minutos, si alguna de las personas asistentes tiene alguna pregunta, alguna consideración que realizar a nuestros panelistas, pues ahora es el momento. Aquí tenéis a Elio, a Karen y a Rebeca a vuestra disposición, pues si tenéis algún tipo de cuestión. Tenemos un tiempo para las preguntas. No sé si alguien quiere Vaya, me dicen que Manuel está conectado. No sé si es posible que pueda entrar. Si le dais no lo veo ahora de momento, pero bueno, yo simplemente darle la bienvenida a Manuel y tiene un rato aún si quiere comentar algo o completar lo que hemos visto en el vídeo. Sí, Manuel. No sé si es posible. Hola, Manuel. Bonjour, Manuel.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oui, déjà.
Yes, I'm there. So,
Bienvenue,
yeah.
bienvenue. Nous avons encore 5 minutes.
Sorry.
On va te donner la chance de compléter. On a déjà vu les vidéos. Mais je vous invite à... Ah, perdón. Perdón. So, Emmanuel, you have 5 minutes to complete what we have already seen the video, so we'll have to.
I think that I shared with you my video, and I tried to explain what we have in terms of problems. So that would be good if I can have some questions so I can respond to questions and give more clarification. Is that right? ¿Aló?
Sí, te escuchamos, Emmanuel. De hecho, habíamos planteado ahora un turno de preguntas tanto para ti como para el resto de panelistas. Si había una persona que tenía una pregunta. No sé si...
Yeah.
Aquí tenemos una pregunta sobre la posible trazabilidad de los minerales, lo podéis ver en el chat, desde que salen del país hasta las fundiciones, smelters y después. No sé si esa es una pregunta para este panel.
Yeah, I think there is a debate in Congo about traceability of cobalt, for instance, copper. I mean, we are about to produce a report on this subject. And I think the idea for Congolese is not, yes, we need to trace minerals, and they are traced in Congo, but we need to improve, to strengthen the system. But what we don't need is the imported system which came out of country, which doesn't take Congolese realities. So what we need the support to support the system with what we have in place. Yeah. And there is a report which will be published soon. We'll try to explain more how Congolese realities, how we think people can help us in that area.
Ok, gracias, Emmanuel. Bueno, yo tengo alguna pregunta. Rápidamente para Karen, has expresado antes la frustración que produce que las autoridades sean escépticas ante vuestras denuncias, entre la ligazón entre la extracción de minerales y las consecuencias en la salud, ¿no? ¿Se ha producido a nivel de vuestra organización algún tipo de acercamiento a instancias superiores vista la inacción del Estado peruano ante esto? Quiero decir, hablo de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. ¿Hay movimientos en ese sentido?
Sí, claro que sí, Octavio. Nosotros en el año 2016 presentamos ante la CNH una audiencia, solicitamos una audiencia temática para visibilizar esta violación de derechos humanos. Se expuso el caso, sin embargo, como sabemos y como ha ocurrido en muchos casos en nuestro país, las recomendaciones que hacen entidades como la CNH no siempre son tomadas en cuenta o incorporadas en el proceso como tal. Y esa es una gran debilidad, porque si bien contamos con mecanismos internacionales que respaldan la defensa de los derechos humanos de ese tipo de poblaciones, poco se hace desde el gobierno para obedecer estas recomendaciones, ¿no? Por otro lado, también desde hace 2 años estamos solicitando una audiencia nuevamente ante la CIDH, pero ya no solamente como Espinar, porque este problema de extractivismo como tal es dado por muchas otras empresas más en nuestro país. O sea, son casos que además están afectando la salud y ya lo ha demostrado data oficial de nuestro país, que afecta a más de 10 millones de personas, Octavio. O sea, 1/3 de nuestra población ya tiene este problema y entonces estamos presentando solicitando una audiencia ante la CIDH. Hemos presentado hace poco 3 cartas al relator de desechos tóxicos de la ONU, al señor Marco Orellana, para que también dé algún nivel de recomendación a nuestro Estado. Hemos pedido y hemos enviado una carta ante la ONU sobre los que ven el caso de la niñez, porque hay muchos niños y niñas afectadas también con el tema del plomo en zonas como Cerro de Pasco, Espinar, entre otros, y también por la vulneración a pueblos indígenas, porque muchas de estas actividades están asentadas en zonas rurales de nuestro país, no están asentadas todas en zonas urbanas. Entonces, esperamos que haya algún nivel de respuestas de los mecanismos internacionales, pero que más allá de las recomendaciones, se cumpla con ello en nuestro país.
Gracias, Karen. Que no quisiera terminar sin preguntar a Rebeca por la membresía de Irma. Sabemos que no solo trabajáis con minas, sino que trabajáis con empresas. ¿Qué representa para una empresa el ser miembro? ¿Qué obligaciones y qué facultades le dais a las empresas? Que no son pocas y que no son pequeñas.
Of course, really, really important question. So the first question that I should say is, or the first answer I want to give is in terms of mining companies. They have a slightly different membership way that they become a member than the other stakeholders. So with mining companies, they can come in and be a member in IRMA, but they only become a pending member when they join. And what that means is that they then need to undergo a third-party audit within 12 months of joining. So they can't come in and simply say, we're a member, we believe in IRMA, and sort of stay in that stance for 4 to 5 years. They actually need to come in and do the work. Then in terms of the purchasing companies, I think that's the question here, what do they need to do? The purchasing companies actually need to make an ask of the mining sector to assess in IRMA. And again, that's really important in terms of uptake, because the IRMA ultimately relies on the market, right? Of course, there are those 5 stakeholder groups, but really it's, again, companies that are hearing from communities and NGOs about the change that they want. And then those purchasing companies, right, the brands that you know of, ask the mining companies to do the assessment. That's really sort of how the links work. And so when a purchasing company makes an ask of the mining sector, yes, we want to buy from you, but we want you to do IRMA. That actually is one of the major reasons that mining companies come into IRMA. And so in order to be a member, purchasing companies must make that ask in a public way or in a direct way or in their sourcing policies, whatever it may be.
Gracias, Rebeca. Bueno, aquí lo dejamos. Pido disculpas a la gente de SETEM, a la gente del mobile por estos 3 minutos que nos hemos comido en el siguiente panel. Rápidamente, simplemente dar las gracias a Karen, a Elio, a Emmanuel y a Rebeca por haber compartido sus vivencias, sus experiencias y su trabajo y su lucha. Y sin más, despido y cerramos este panel dándoos las gracias a todos y todas. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.
Hasta la próxima.
Thank you so much.
Bé, doncs donem per finalitzada aquesta primera taula veus de resistència a les mines en temps de Covid. Moltes gràcies als protagonistes d'aquesta, a la Karen, l'Uke, a l'Emanuel, a l'Ilvio Cruz, a Rebeca Barton i també a l'Octavio Hermano per moderar-la. Sabem que hi havia més preguntes, però heu vist que anàvem curts de temps. I hem de continuar amb el programa d'avui. De totes maneres, moltes gràcies per seguir-nos i també per les qüestions que ens heu formulat. I com dèiem, a aquesta hora continuem amb aquesta segona taula de la jornada d'avui, a la que hem volgut titular com el poder de la compra pública socialment responsable en l'electrònica. Es respondran a preguntes com ara d'on venen els minerals que importa la indústria tecnològica europea i quines condicions de treball s'extreuen. Tenen alguna cosa a dir-hi les administracions públiques? Aquestes són algunes de les preguntes que s'han formulat. I bé, aquest debat el moderarà la Carla Canal. La Carla ha treballat en l'àmbit de la coherència de polítiques públiques per al desenvolupament sostenible, tant a la Generalitat de Catalunya com actualment a la Direcció de Justícia Global i Cooperació Internacional de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, i ja la tenim a punt amb nosaltres. Carla, molt bon dia.
Hola, bon dia. Gràcies Georgina, presentaré primer la taula en català i els participants i després em canviaré a l'anglès per fer-los les preguntes. Doncs, molt agraïda de poder estar en aquesta taula parlant del poder de la compra pública socialment responsable en l'electrònica, perquè realment les administracions públiques tenen un poder i una responsabilitat i una obligació d'avançar molt millor i molt més ràpid, perquè sí s'estan fent coses, però encara estem lluny del que hauríem d'estar. I crec que aquests tres exemples i aquestes tres discussions ens ajudaran a avançar una mica en aquest debat. Primer de tot parlarà la Silke Ronse, que és una geòloga belga especialitzada en sòls i aigües subterrànies. Ella treballa com a consultora en contaminació de sòls i aigües i, a més, és voluntària a Catapa, que és una ONG belga, des de fa més de 8 anys, en els quals ha dirigit estudis sobre àrees altament afectades per la mineria a Bolívia i ens presentarà un dels últims estudis de Catapa. Després parlarà l'Erin Severholt, però la presentaré després. Si la Silke està a punt, li donaria la paraula.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. Will I share my presentation? Here it should be. So, everybody sees the screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So, last 2 years we were doing research on the Bolivian mining cooperatives. And last year we also continued the supply chain to link it with the European industry. So we were not only visiting the mining cooperatives to see the situation that is occurring there, but also the whole supply chain. But let's start with the mining cooperatives in Bolivia. It's quite an important amount of people who are working as cooperatives in Bolivia. As we can see, like in this first graph, the yellow-brown part is the amount of miners that work in cooperatives, in a cooperative way, and only a small part is private and public state mines. But at the other side, if we see the amount of minerals that they are extracting, then we see that those mining cooperatives only are a small part of all minerals that are mined. This is in one part because of the equipment they have. They don't always are able to do big investments to have good equipment, but also because they work in very old mines, many times mines that date from colonial times, and where the good minerals, the good veins are already exhausted. Which kind of metals are they extracting? We focused on the department of Oruro. This is whole Bolivia. This is the highlands where most metal mining is being done. And we focus on Oruro just because different departments of the country have different kind of metals and different kind of circumstances. The most important metals are tin and the minerals that contain zinc and silver. They mostly occur in the same veins and the same area. And they mostly don't only contain zinc and silver, but also lead and also some interesting metals, such as, for example, indium we found. but those things, but the indium, for example, does not appear in the statistics because it's not notified. It's produced as a side product. But let's go to the mines themselves. Those are two female miners which work in this mine in the city center of Oruro, actually. They say, well, we can gain a lot more money if we work in the mine than maybe if we work in a shop. So for them, it's interesting to work in the mine. But it also gives a lot of insecurity for them because they can have months where they don't find good veins. They cannot extract valuable materials, and then they go to sell their material and they say, well, this has no value at all. So those times they don't have any income, which gives big insecurity. Also, at the point we were visiting them, the zinc prices were very low for some miners to tell us that they're thinking about stopping because it's not giving sufficient income at that moment. So their life is very dependent on the market price of only one metal. Another point we have been seeing is the insecurity. Accidents occur a lot, and which can be fatal because the galleries are very small, people can fall, rocks can fall. And this is because they work for their own income. It's not always easy to make big investments or to invest a lot of time in also digging the rock that doesn't give them any income. And that's the reason why the mines become quite dangerous to work in. Also, we see a lot of miners not wearing masks, which causes illnesses, silicosis, which is the miner's lung. We heard about young people less than 25 years old, which are not able to work anymore because of the miner's lung is causing them their lungs are not serving anymore already at a very young age, which are very dramatic situations. And something we didn't touch yet is the environmental contamination. This is a treatment plant. Water is extracted from the mine to be able to work inside the mine. But although it's meant for treatment, the treatment is not done because it is continuously inverting money for something that doesn't give them any income. And this is acid water, pH of 3, which is running directly into the river. And for sure also containing a high variety of different heavy metals. In the mining cooperatives, they don't only extract the minerals, but they can also do like some further processing to give some added value. Not all mining cooperatives have the ability, not have the machines to do this kind of work, but those who have those think it's quite interesting to have some added value. Here they are grinding the rock in smaller pieces, and then they manually separate the heavier metal-containing rock from the lighter waste rock. Here they do it manually, but here they can also have some more mechanized ways to separate the valuable minerals from the rest. Then the point comes where they have to sell their production, and some tell us that they just rent a taxi for them to put the bags they produced inside and sell it to a local buyer. And many times then it's not the one who is offering most money for what they produce, but the ones that can pay the fastest, because it's important for them to have their income on time. Other cooperatives, they have like trucks, 1 or 2 trucks, and then they gather all the material from their members. Because those cooperatives, they can be 20 people, but it can be also like 100 or until 500 people inside one cooperative. And then they gather all the materials of all the people and they sell it all together to local buyers. Then the local buyers, their role is to prepare batches for export. They have also the contracts with the international buyers. An important one is Trafigura, who is buying the zinc concentrates, for example, in this area. They gather batches, they mix it, they can maybe do some further processing also themselves. And then it is transported by truck to the port of, to some ports of Chile, as Bolivia doesn't have a port themselves in this area. And for those concentrates, mainly the port of Arica is used at the coast of Chile. From there, it is transported by boats to the international market. We decided to further concentrate on the zinc concentrates, which also, as I said, contain silver, but also some less known metals such as indium. And if we see which countries Bolivia is exporting to, we see 5 main countries. We further researched on Belgium because we are based in Belgium. But yeah, also big importance goes to 3 Asian countries and to Spain. But as I said, we focused further on Belgium. So let's look at what Belgium is importing in terms of zinc concentrates. And there we see that Bolivia is the main supplier for zinc concentrates, arriving at the port of Antwerp in Belgium, together with Mexico and many other countries. And from there, it's further distributed. The transport from Chile to the port of Antwerp happens with large bulk carriers. This is the boat or the ship Jan van Gent, which last year was transporting zinc concentrates to the port of Antwerp. At the time we were researching, but each time with our other ships. And this is Seeinvest. It's a terminal in the port of Antwerp, which receives most, if not all, the zinc concentrates that arrive to Belgium. Here they can further grind the rocks, but mainly they take samples of the rocks to then decide where the materials go to for further processing. Their main client is Nyrstar. Nyrstar was, until a few years ago, a Belgian zinc smelter. Now it is bought by Trafigura. And they have, among others, they have a metallurgical plant in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, for what is this area. No? They also have other ones around the world. And as we know that the Bolivian concentrates contain also this indium I was mentioning before, we can expect that after analysis, many of the Bolivian concentrates will go to this plant. It is the plant of Nyrstar in Obi, in France, close to the Belgian border. And in this plant, they do not only produce the zinc metal. They don't only, yeah?
Silke, sorry. You have 2 more minutes. Maybe also you could go to the conclusions. If not, I will ask you also a question later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in this plant, they produce the zinc metal, but since 10 years, they also produce indium metal here. It was a quite big inversion, but it appears to be a good business to also produce this indium. It's a good thing that Nyrstar is using more metals from the same waste rock. Once it is extracted, it's a good thing to use as much of it as possible, but it has a counter side because, for example, the Bolivian state expects to be for the buyers to pay royalties for all the metals that are commercially used. although Nyrstar is buying indirectly for the zinc they import from Bolivia, but not for the indium they are importing. Bolivia knows that their minerals contain indium, but they have no idea about how much indium it contains, how much of it is further used commercially. And no royalties at all are paid for the indium that comes from Bolivia. Also, the miners who have sometimes difficulties to have enough income, they could use this extra. As they are paid for the value of the material they are delivering, it is normal that they would also be paid for the indium content of the mineral they are delivering. This is the plant.
Silke, yes, you have 1 more minute. I'm so sorry because it is so interesting, and I also read the report, and so I thought maybe if you could a little bit lead to the conclusions, and
it's the
afterwards.
last slide anyway. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So this is the plant of Umicore. It's another plant. It's based in Belgium itself, and here they work on the waste materials that are coming from the other smelters. They also extract this indium. And I want to conclude with this indium story, because maybe some people don't know what indium is used for. It's got an important rise in use around 10 years ago, mainly because it is an important substance for the flat panel displays, for touch screens, for LCD screens. Indium is a main component to make this technology possible. So that is what I want to share with you about the zinc supply chain, but at the end it appeared also be the history of the indium supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silke. I will now, ara introduiré la Elin Seveholt. I will now introduce Elin, but after these 2 presentations, we will have time for some questions, and after we will do the interview with Peter Paulicki. So I will change to Catalan again. Sorry, we have all the languages today. So, la Elin Seveholt és assessora de sostenibilitat a l'Ajuntament de Stavanger, a Noruega. Ella participa en el compromís del municipi amb la contractació transparent i sostenible i anteriorment havia treballat com a consultora de sostenibilitat a Greenco i a Nordic Choice Hotels. La Elin és llicenciada en sostenibilitat per l'Escola Internacional de Negocis d'Estocolm i també aprofito per dir que el mobile és una oportunitat excel·lent per conèixer les entitats i les administracions que estan treballant en aquests temps. També dir-vos que totes aquestes entitats estan obertes a cooperar, a col·laborar, per dir-vos que la Elin, des del seu ajuntament, està en contacte amb l'Ajuntament de Barcelona. Nosaltres els hi preguntem coses en concret, ens contesten. Són persones que, a part de publicar tot el que poden, estan obertes a que els contactem i ens donen consells, etc. Participem en diversos grups de treball i també us deixaré aquí el meu e-mail per si algú que es connecta ara tingués preguntes més endavant, també que sapigueu que ens podem posar en contacte i per començar, com diguéssim, a formar part d'aquestes xarxes que tenim per avançar amb la compra pública responsable juntament amb les ONGs i les altres administracions. Llavors, Elin, I will now pass the floor to you, and after your presentation, we would have a little bit time to ask questions to you and Silke. Okay, so Elin, now it's your time.
Thank you, Carla. I hope you can see my screen now. See?
Yes, if you would. Yes, great.
Yes. Let me just swap screens. There we go. Okay, so thank you, Carla, and thank you, Settings, for having me today. It's very exciting to, as Carla just said, to be able to share among us. It's important for the progress of transparency in the public procurement. So I know time is limited. I'm going to go just straight to the presentation. I'll touch a bit on the action plan we have here in Stavanger, I'm going to give you an example of a procurement that we had last year and some of the details of the procurement details, and also a little bit about the challenges and lessons learned that we had. So first off, in Norway, as I think in many other countries, there is the procurement law that requires public buyers to do what they can to limit the risks of violation of human rights. So of course we follow this, but we also want to go a little bit further and work with suppliers that are forward-leaning. So suppliers that have insight and control of their supply chain and that know where the risks are most severe. So as we heard today, for example, the mining stage. So the action plan is part of our procurement strategy, and it aims to ensure that our procurements are made in a sustainable, resource efficient, and non-discriminatory way. End of each year, we do an overall risk assessment of all the procurements that are due the following year. And after that, we decide on which procurements that will include social criteria. So for last year, among others, we saw that there were several procurements in ICT coming up. And for several of these procurements, we did have a market dialogue with the suppliers, where they were able to give their response and perspective on the details of our procurement. And for the first procurement that I'm just going to talk more about in a second, we saw that the suppliers were much more engaged in talking about environmental aspects, but not so much about the social criteria. But for example, in another procurement, the procurement of printers, it was much more engagement in the social criteria discussion. So I think we can learn from all of these procurements. All right, so the procurement of Chromebook. As I said, there were several of them, but this was the first one out, and the one with maybe the hardest approach. So apart from the general contract, we used a special contract that is for social criteria, and it's based on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and it uses due diligence as a method. In this procurement, we also used qualification requirement, and that is to make sure that the tenders have a quality system in place, that they have methods to fulfill the terms of our contract. So we asked the tender to describe how the company works with the social sustainability inside the company and in the supply chain. So as you can see, it's very small, but there's a assessment that we asked them to fill in. And first part is about traceability in the supply chain. So they have to pick the 2 products that they believe are associated with the greatest risks at the time of the tender. Second part here is an overall risk assessment of the 2 same products. And the last part is about the code of conduct and how they are following up the code of conduct in their supply chain. And as you can see as well, for the technical specification, these were much more specialized and focused on the minerals used in the products. So as we just heard, this is a stage in production line where there is quite high risks. So by using these criteria, we knew that the supplier was using a manufacturer that was also working at this section of their supply line. And luckily, all the tenders we received were complying with these criteria. So that was good. All right, but to focus even more on social issues, we also used award criteria. And for this procurement of Chromebooks, it was weighted 60%, and it was solely on social award criteria. And the last 40% was on price. So we divided the social criteria into 4 under criteria, and they were weighted 25% each. The first part here was about the supplier's internal system for social responsibility. So we asked them to describe their internal training of employees, how they measure labor and human rights in relation to other aspects, and also the procedures for suspending or termination of contracts with manufacturers. And the second part, as I said earlier, we were aiming for a high degree of transparency. So it was therefore important to know about the manufacturer and its suppliers. And we therefore asked for the manufacturer's code of conduct. And we asked for information on, for example, mining process, lists of extraction facilities, mining sites, and other locations relevant for the products that they offered us. And for this procurement, we received information down to the process of melting, but nothing concrete covering the mineral stage. This was somehow expected, as we know that following the raw materials before melting is often complicated. As we heard from Emmanuel and Silke, the system for traceability of minerals needs to be better. So we did receive information and documentation that the suppliers include the mining stage in their work, but we didn't get any names of extraction sites. But as we used the technical criteria before that I mentioned before, we knew that the manufacturer was certified in accordance to the RMI, which was good. And I also think that the standard of IRMA that we heard of earlier is very interesting, and we will look closer at how this can be useful for us. Third criteria was capacity building. So we wanted to know if the tenderer was doing any capacity building in their supply chain. And fourth criteria was external cooperation. So was the tenderer working with any external organizations like non-profit organizations? Yeah, so that was the criteria that we used for Chromebooks. And I'll just, as I just mentioned, it was the first one, and we did have several other procurements last year. And some of the criteria there were a bit simpler and not weighted as much. And when outlining criteria, it's important to look at how developed the suppliers are. So last year's procurements, they taught us that there are different levels of maturity in the categories of ICT. So it is therefore important to adjust the criteria in accordance to the maturity level. So one way of doing this is it's one way of pushing for sustainability and social criteria, but still apply with the maturity level is to use contract details. For example, we can let the suppliers know by the contract details that in, for example, 1 year, we expect that this criteria is implemented. In Stavanger, we also want as many suppliers as possible to deliver on our procurements. I think that's common by public procurers, but not if it means that we must lower our standards to a degree that can't comply with our values. So with other words, it can be complicated to outline procurement documents and especially award criteria. And after the evaluation process for several of the ICT procurements last year, the suppliers wanted insight in each other's tenders, which is quite common for other criteria as well. But as their system for social sustainability was now weighted, no one wanted to share information. And for us, wanting to lift the whole market and seeing the different approaches that the suppliers have for sustainability, as well as what they can learn from each other, that was a bit frustrating. So I think that to stimulate the whole market and for public buyers to be able to be proactive and using social criteria, there must be more collaborations between suppliers and also between suppliers and buyers. So like pre-dialogue meetings and events like this, for example. As Carla mentioned, we were happy to share among other buyers in Europe as well. But following the procurement framework, we have received a lot of reactions from the public, and we've been able to share our experience with them. We have also received reactions from the market that they want us to keep on focusing on social criteria in the ICT procurements. Our suppliers also say that when public buyers ask for transparency and use criteria like this, they can use it to stimulate their own suppliers and brand owners to improve their own processes. All right, I think time is running up, so I'll just finish off by going back to the award criteria itself. It has later been considered in a legal perspective when we used it in a procurement of general ICT equipment. So the criteria then became the basis for an appeal to the Public Procurement Appeals Board. And the appeal was regarding both the outline of the criteria and the evaluation method. And just a few days ago, we received the verdict. And unfortunately, the board concluded that criteria number 3, capacity building, and criteria number 4, external cooperation, lacks the necessary connection to the computer equipment. So the verdict has not just been handled by our jurists, so I can therefore not give you any more information on this, but I expect that the documents will be publicly available. But we see the outcome of this complaint as a significant learning for both us and public procurers, I think, in Norway, but maybe also outside of Norway. So it has been an opportunity to put even more spotlight on the issues of social public procurements. And we now hope that this will lead to a broader understanding and clarifications on the laws and regulations on how we as public buyers can use social criteria in our procurements. Right, so that was everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elin. I will now pass actually to Peter Pawlicki from Electronics Watch because we are running out of time. But after the interview we will do with Peter, we will have time for some questions. So do not hesitate to write it in the chat. If not, I do have many questions because, as Elin said, it is crucial that this dialogue between the organizations in the field, the NGOs, the companies, and the public buyers, and also the general public, in order to do the same, to go in the same direction, and as Emmanuel stressed, not to look for solutions far from the reality. So we will have time to talk a little bit about this later. But let me now introduce Peter Pawlicki. Sorry if I do not pronounce your name well, but Peter, you will teach me another time. He's based in Germany. He has more than 15 years of experience researching the globalization of the electronics industry and its impact on working conditions and labor rights. He has been part of several international research projects on contract manufacturing. Peter is Director of Outreach and Education at Electronics Watch. So, Peter, how are you? Are you here with us?
Yes, thank you. How are you?
Really great. Happy to have the mobile again.
Yes.
So maybe before we jump into the discussion about this RBA and the terms of the engagement, could you first tell us briefly what Electronics Watch is doing? Maybe not everybody.
Sure. I think many people that I've seen on the participation board already know it, but many probably don't. So Elin's introduction was really great because now we know that public buyers actually can include social criteria in procurement. So that's kind of that's a great thing. The big question is, how can public buyers make sure that these criteria, these social or environmental criteria, are actually implemented in the supply chain that they are buying from? And that's the role that Electronics Watch is taking. So we are monitoring in the factories for our members or affiliates, how we call them. So these are public buyers in Europe and in Australia. We are monitoring in these factories. We are using something that is called worker-driven monitoring. So we are talking to workers, we are working with workers, and we put the interest of workers at the center of what we do. So this is how we get to know what is happening in the factory. After that, we go to the brands, so all the big brands you know, with the reports we have generated, and tell them, look, we have found these risks, we have found these violations, and we want to work with you to improve on the situation. So at the end of the process, the idea is to have a better situation for workers in the factories. Our affiliates are members. They are our members from public buyers. So hospitals, schools, universities, city councils, regional governments, all these organizations that procure ICT hardware based on public procurement regulation.
Thank you very much. I just want to add that Barcelona City Council and also Generalitat de Catalunya, ACM, okay, I'm just talking because I know we have some Catalan public, just to know that other cities in Catalonia, in Spain, in France, in Norway, etc., are apart from Electronics Watch, and we are really happy because we do like this approach, this sensitive approach, and that the final result is the improvement of the situation of the workers. So yeah, when Electronics Watch works with the industry, you work a lot with brands, no, like Apple, Cisco, Dell, HP, or Samsung. And also now you engage with the RBA. So could you tell us who or what is RBA?
Sure. So yes, I completely forgot to mention that Catalonia region and all its entities, it's actually one of the most leading regions when it comes to sustainable public procurement. So it's always really great to come to Barcelona, even if it's only digitally. So the RBA is the Responsible Business Alliance. It is to put it very briefly, it is an industry association of the electronics industry. The RBA has established a voluntary scheme to improve working and environmental conditions throughout the electronics supply chain. Most brands you would know, so the ones Carla already mentioned, and every brand that you think of that has something to do in electronics, most of them are members of the RBA, and also their manufacturers. So companies like Foxconn that you might have heard of, or companies like Quanta, Inventec, but also the component companies. So companies like Intel, you might know, or any TSMC is right now in the news. So all of them are members of the RBA. The RBA is pretty, I don't want to say old, but they already have a history. They were founded in 2004 as the Electronics Industry Citizen Coalition back then. And they introduced this voluntary code of conduct. And for years, many civil society organizations were criticizing the RBA very strongly because the code was actually not in line with the central ILO core labor standard. So it was below these standards. It took a lot of work from civil society organizations, a lot of pressure, a lot of reports and well, a lot of work basically to get the RBA to be where it is at right now. So the code is mostly in line with the ILO core labor standards. There are some discussions about the definition of freedom of association, and there might be legal interpretations that say it's not yet there. But so we see a development. The development took quite long. It was 16 years or 17 years for an industry that is always saying we are so fast, we are so innovative, we do so many things. It's a bit, I would say it took a bit long, but they are there. They have this voluntary scheme, and this is why because we represent public buyers towards the electronics industry, obviously their industry association is also a partner of, not a partner, but a point of contact for us.
Yeah, so last month, Electronics Watch has signed a terms of engagement with RBA, and well, I know something about it, but I am curious if you can explain, because a few years ago, this would have been difficult, no? So yeah. If you can tell us a little bit more about.
So yes, so you know, as I mentioned, the RBA has a process. They have a code of conduct. They have auditing schemes. They have a process. Electronics Watch has also a process. So we have this worker-driven monitoring. We have a methodology how to do the monitoring. We have a specific system how to engage with the industry. So both organizations basically have their systems how to do things. These systems don't really work very well together. So the terms of engagement, when you take a very big step back, it's actually defining an interface between these two systems, so to make them compatible. It defines steps, so it says what is to be done. It says how long it can take, and the how long is actually a very important part. Who needs to be involved and what the output is. So we have standardized basically how we work together. It took 12 months of negotiation. The negotiations were very strenuous, they were very hard. But already during the process, we saw that there is a mutual learning on both sides, on the side of the RBA and on our side. I think we developed a better understanding of who we are, where we come from. We have not become partners. No, we are still on the opposite of the room, but we have learned how to work together, how to cooperate. For Electronics Watch, our understanding is that sustainable change in the factories will only happen when cooperation will occur on various levels. We are in no position to force something on companies. We are talking here about companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies. There is currently no force to do it by force, but cooperation can lead to change, and this is why we think that this defines cooperation, how we will. And we do think that this agreement will strengthen our role to protect workers' rights and affiliate supply chains. Very important, my last point, it's transparent. So you can actually go to our website and download the document and read it.
Good, good. This is really interesting. And I wanted also to ask you about what do you think will be the challenge in this but also, I want also to ask you something different, in line more with the mining. I know that Electronics Watch has a very good system until the factories, and you participate like other partners in other projects, looking more the transparency through mining, no? And I don't know if you will also work with this with RBA until the mines, and yeah, and that's it. If you want just to finish saying what are the challenges, or why do you think this is good for the people? No, this kind of very hard negotiations. I mean, I understand. So yeah.
So yes, our long-term perspective is definitely going beyond factories, looking into mines. We currently have 3 pilot projects in Bolivia, in Congo, and in the Philippines to look into how to do worker-driven monitoring and industry engagement. Mining is a complete different beast. We are learning a lot. We're actually learning probably more from our monitoring partners than they learn from us. So this will take some time. What is the importance of this result that we have had with the RBA? I think the biggest sign for me that this document is that it acknowledges actually the power of public procurement, of organized public procurement. So again, what Ellen mentioned, this public buyers coming together, sharing ideas, but also coming together and building a platform to coordinate their communication, their actions towards the industry. This is important. Electronics Watch is kind of this platform, and this document, these terms of engagement, actually are the acknowledgement that this is powerful. What are the challenges? Well, let's see how this will work out. Until now, we have a document. Fine. It's a result of a lot of work. Great. But we want to be accountable so if you ask me in 1 year time, I might be fuming. I might have a red hat and start saying everything went wrong, or I might be very happy and say, well, we learned a lot. Now we apply these learnings to develop this terms of engagement further, because the idea is to have revisions of this document, to improve it as we go along. But what the outcomes will be, we will just see in practice, because now it's just a document. We have started to already, some processes have already started to engage based on this, but in 1 year time we can. So in the next Mobile Social Congress in 2022, we will be definitely able to talk more about how happy we are with it and what impacts we see.
Yes, we hope so. Thank you very much, Peter. I will now, I mean, if there are not other questions from the public, I will just end up this session by asking you three. I mean, I saw in the Katapa document, in the conclusions, no, they said that the EU's diligence framework is not working, no, because it is not comprehensive. There is no transparency because there is no mandatory to the companies to collect data and make it accessible to the public, so everybody can check its veracity. There's no accountability towards workers and communities, and there is no governing body. So there's a lot of things. But to focus on transparency, because this is a common subject between the three participants of this panel, do you think that, I mean, I saw, just to come back to the public procurement, when we saw a good example is an example that they, I mean, that they do ask for some transparency, but only in two of the levels, no, of the chain. So yeah, I mean, what do you think should be the next steps also in asking transparency from the computer until the mine? I mean, not only until the factory, that this already we have with Electronics Watch. In Barcelona, for example, we put in the contract, we want to know exactly in what company is made, and we have this information. But if we say we want to know exactly from what mine does the minerals come, they do not answer this. So, but I mean, I just wanted to remember that public procurers can ask these transparency requirements. I mean, it is legal to ask for this. And come on, I mean, these brands, I mean, if Tesla can go to the moon, Tesla can know where the minerals come from, no? So, I mean, there are technical and local ways to know all the transparency. So what do you all think should be done by public procurers to ask for transparency in all the way? Thank you.
I'll just start with my input. I think maybe Peter is better to answer this question. But as I said, in general, in our qualification requirement, we use the two-step, as you say, like down to production level and the parts of the products. So just two steps. And that is somehow the basic. And what we tried in this procurement was to use it as an award criteria as well, to see if they could go further. But yeah, we didn't get any concrete information on that. I think as a public buyer as well, you need to keep the competition up. You need to secure that you get tenders. So I think it needs to come on a higher level. Maybe as Peter is saying, like together with the organizations like Electronic Watch that actually have more insights. I mean, I was surprised too. I know that it was somehow complicated to follow the minerals up to melting, but when Silke was talking about the taxis and that way of selling the minerals, it's pretty hard for us at this end to come with criteria that like is very specific. But I would love to hear what Peter says as well.
Well, I think it's important to move along, and basically, yes, companies always say it's hard, but I think if more public buyers ask about these things, then they will learn that they have to deliver. And I think also, and this is why I liked your example, Ellen, to also put it into the award criteria. So kind of not only ask, but kind of tighten the screws each time you ask about it. And not only ask about tier 1 or tier 2, but ask also about tier 3, because, the lower you go, even in manufacturing, the worse the conditions get. I mean, yes, the final assembly factories already look fine because they were for the last 10 years already in the focus of many civil society organizations. But if you go to tier 3 companies that basically supply the suppliers, it's really bad. I think what we need to change, and this is something that I think public buyers are very good to in a good position to do, is to change the discussion and not say, well, the industry is always saying it's not possible. But the industry has to say, how is it possible? Because if Silke, coming from a small NGO in Belgium, can trace the supply chain, how can't Apple, HP, and Dell, who are making billions each year, how can't they? I mean, it's just a decision to either not know or to know. It's a decision to invest or not to invest. The question is then how to communicate as a public buyer. And award criteria are a good point, because if you put this as an award criteria, and this would help a brand to kind of offset the cost for such a program to understand this, well, that's an incentive that you can actually work with. So I think we need to get public buyers to be more persistent and more kind of be more radical in what they ask for. And it's actually not radical to ask for to knowing where the stuff is coming from, because this is just the first step of transparency, to know where it's coming from. The next step is asking, what do you know? Tell me about your audit reports. What have you been doing? So, knowing the supply chain is just the first step. And even there, yeah.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sorry, I have to cut it here. I do agree with you. And I also think not only award criteria, but as a requirement, we should ask transparency. Because if not, people, I mean, there are companies that say, we could do it, but if the others are not obliged, we will not do it. So it would be mandatory. And they do have the technical capacities to I mean, they do have, I mean, they cannot say it's impossible, come on. So I'm so sorry, we did 5 minutes more, apart from the others. So yes, I will pass now to the presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Moltes gràcies als ponents d'aquesta segona taula, comprar responsablement amb l'electrònica. Thank you, Sílvia, Aline, Peter i sobretot a la moderadora, la Carla Canal. Bé, ara en principi us convidem a fer una breu pausa. Ho farem amb un vídeo que projectarem, que hem realitzat conjuntament amb CETEM, el BOAN i Enginyeria Sin Fronteres, respecte als impactes de la mineria a la República Democràtica del Congo. El posarem en castellà, no us el perdeu. Un cop acabat aquest vídeo ja introduirem aquesta tercera taula d'aquesta primera jornada d'avui. Fins ara.
Cada día conectas con cientos de conflictos armados. Nuestros aparatos electrónicos contienen minerales cuya explotación genera un importante impacto. En lugares como la República Democrática del Congo, a la extracción se suma un contexto de conflicto armado y la violación sistemática de los derechos humanos. Por eso es importante que nos informemos para poder actuar.
We bring human rights cases all over the world, and I now have one in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I represent 14 families. 8 of the families represent children who were injured in mine collapses. The children are given shovels and they dig tunnels to reach the cobalt veins, and they dig in very loose rock. They don't have any protective beams, no protective equipment, and inevitably the tunnels collapse. We have sued 5 of the largest technology companies there are. In the case of Apple and Microsoft and Tesla, they claim to be trillion-dollar companies, and they have turned a blind eye to what they know is going on in the DRC, and that is children are being maimed and killed.
Je viens de la République démocratique du Congo, de sa partie Est. Mon organisation, la Synergie des femmes pour les victimes de violences sexuelles, travaille pour la promotion du droit de la femme en général et de la femme victime de violences sexuelles en particulier. L'Est de la République démocratique du Congo est riche, c'est un scandale géologique, et riche en minerais. C'est une malédiction, puisque l'exploitation illégale font que les femmes et les filles sont violentées chaque jour, font que les femmes et les filles et même les hommes sont tués chaque jour lors des affrontements. Il y a l'environnement qui est détruit et il y a des personnes qui perdent leur vie. Nous voulons vraiment que ces multinationales qui se donnent à l'exploitation illégale des ressources naturelles s'occuper du bien-être des populations vivant dans les sites où ces minerais sont exploités.
Promover un modelo electrónico justo que garantice los derechos humanos es imprescindible. No seas cómplice de una electrónica injusta. Juntas y juntos podemos hacer que esto cambie.
D'avui us tornem a recordar, sobretot molt important, que la sessió està sent gravada i us demanem que mantingueu els micròfons en silenci per evitar interrompre els ponents, que moltes vegades això pot distreure el que és el discurs. Si teniu preguntes, dirigir-les al xat des d'on les anirem recollint, i us recordeu també que disposem d'un sistema d'interpretació en anglès i en espanyol per qui vulgui fer-ho en una llengua que no sigui el català. Bé, moment, com dèiem, d'arribar a aquest tercer panell, aquesta tercera taula. Avui ho fem amb la taula, en aquest cas, titulada Llibertat sindical i justícia, els reptes de treballar a l'electrònica global, on s'analitzaran els reptes a què s'enfronten les persones treballadores de la indústria, accentuades per la Covid-19, en aquesta situació en la que ens trobem ara mateix, tot posant l'accent en la llibertat d'associació, el treball forçós i la càrrega viscuda per les dones pel que fa a l'exposició a químics. Ho moderarà Dina Septi, ara mateix establerta a Indonèsia. Dina és actualment la coordinadora regional de Good Electronics, un dels principals col·laboradors d'aquesta 6a edició del Mobile Social Congress. La Dina ha treballat al Centre de Recursos Laborals de Sedan a Indonèsia i a aquesta mateixa hora ja dono la paraula perquè pugui presentar ponents i moderar aquesta tercera, que és la tercera d'aquesta primera jornada d'avui.
Hello.
Hello, Dina. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't hear the English translation, so I was a little bit shocked. Hello. Shall we start now? Can I start now?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dina Septi. I will be the moderator for this session, and I welcome you all. Maybe you've already been here before me, or we were just everyone who just got arrived here, and this is the day one of the Mobile Social Congress. And in this session, we will be discussing the freedom of association and justice, the challenges in the global electronic industry. There will be 4 speakers in the session. First, there will be Jeroen Merk from University of Edinburgh and Fahmi Panimbang from LIPS, Indonesia. Sorry. And then second, there will be Heather White, a documentary filmmaker, research consultant, and also Olaf Bjornsen from Swedwatch. We will have 1 hour. Is everyone here all? Okay, yes, I see Jeroen are already here, and Fahmi, I haven't seen Fahmi, but maybe he's...
I'm here, Dina.
Okay, that's great. Hi, Fahmi. Okay, so just like I said before, we have 1 hour, and I will give sign if the time will run out for every one of you. And without further ado, I will invite our first speaker, Jeroen Merk from University of Edinburgh. So Jeroen Merk is a labor and human rights expert and hold a PhD in international relations from University of Sussex, Brighton. His research interests lie at the crossroads of international relations, political economy, social movement, and the governance institutions of global industrial relations. He has published on these topics in peer-reviewed journals and academic books. And I will also introduce Fahmi as well before. So Jeroen will present and then followed by Fahmi afterward. And now Fahmi was with the Asian Monitor Research Center Hong Kong and coordinated the Asian TNC Monitoring Network. He also coordinated regional research to support the struggle of Samsung workers across Asia. And Jeroen has just finished his research in Indonesia on freedom of association in the electronic industry. And would you like to share your screen now, Jeroen, or maybe later? And you have 15 minutes, Jeroen. Afterward, Fahmi will follow your presentation, and I will tell you when the time is almost run up. I will just interrupt your presentation later. Okay, the time is yours, Jeroen.
Yes, thank you, Dina. Thank you for the organizers as well. I have to share my screen. See. I don't know, for one reason or another, I cannot share my screen. Just so maybe I should just go ahead without my PowerPoint. Is that okay?
I will try share your presentation, Jeroen, if I can do that. Let me see.
Jeroen, we will try to share our screen so that you can see your slides, okay?
Okay, yeah. I can also just start, right? I mean, I could do it without the presentation.
Yes, I think so.
All right, let me see. So I did a little research together with Hari Nugroho on freedom of association in the electronics industry in Indonesia. This was part of the Make ICT Fair project.
Sorry, this is my presentation showing now. Sorry.
Sorry for that. They're all in the same folder. It's coming. You can speak, Jeroen, and we will put your presentation.
So this was part of the Make ICT Fair program that just ended a few months ago. And we did field work in 2 regions in Indonesia, in Bekasi and in, which is close to Jakarta, next to Jakarta, and in Batam, which is close to Singapore. And both are very important electronic industry hubs areas. Let me see. So the research was part of a bigger research on freedom of association in the electronics industry. And of course, freedom of association is known as an enabling right or process right, which would give workers a possibility to improve their own conditions and monitor their workplace conditions at the work floor, and also, let's say, struggle or negotiate for better working conditions there. So it's already at the next slide, if you can, yeah. So, but in general, in electronics, very few unions exist. In most countries, the union movement is extremely weak, or the state does basically not allow for free trade unions. There's political repression of trade unions, and there's also a lot of corporate opposition to trade unions. And Indonesia is an interesting case because it's one of the few countries in production, let's say in the south, where the law allows trade unions to operate. So this is pretty different from Vietnam or many other countries in that region where these legal protections are absent. Okay. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we did research in Indonesia over the last year, which was partly interrupted by COVID-19. So we had to end our survey in Batam at the time, because that was in March 2020, I'm sorry. But we did our research in Bekasi, and we had 4 different factories with different positions in the supply chain. So a number of tier 1 factories that directly supply or as the mother company or a brand, and we had tier 2 companies which are lower in the supply chain, and a tier 3 company, which is basically a component supplier for one of the tier 1 factories. And we did a survey of 200 people through a snowballing process, and we worked with local unions to get access to the workers. And we also did a number of in-depth interviews with trade union leaders and NGO representatives, activists, academics, ILO people, etc. Next slide, please. So if you look at the electronics industry in Indonesia, it's as I said already, it's very much focused on Jakarta on the one hand, with Bekasi as the most important hub, and Batam, close to Singapore, as the second important hub. It's basically, Indonesia was quite late with attracting the electronics industry. So it was until the mid 1980s, it was basically focused on the domestic market. But then there was an attempt to attract more export industries, and electronics was one of them from the mid 1980s onwards. But still, if we and they focused on the labor-intensive consumer electronics and also electronic components. So Indonesia is pretty small if you compare it to other countries in the region. So there are about 360 manufacturers, and about 260,000 workers are active in the industry. But this is very small compared to Vietnam or Malaysia or China, of course. Next slide, please. Can you slide on? Yeah. So just, I mean, you can see Indonesia is at a very low level of export when it comes to components and parts, as well as finished products. And since 2010, let's say the export volume has also going down in Indonesia. So Indonesia is pretty small, but it is often identified as an important electronic site for the future. So because it's a very large country with a very young population, so you can often see that investors often argue that Indonesia can become very important in the future. Next slide. So we have seen in Indonesia an transition 20 years ago from a very authoritarian regime to a more democratic regime. And under that past regime, there was only one union allowed, the SPSI, which is pretty much like China or Vietnam today. And after 1998, Indonesia ratified ILO conventions, the ILO core conventions, including those on freedom of association and collective bargaining. So on the one hand, on the reformasi, under the new regime, trade unions were allowed and emerged very rapidly. Next slide, please. And many unions emerged, and there was still quite an active trade union movement, but there are also still many barriers to freedom of association, also in the electronics industry, but more widely as well. So there is an institutionally, trade union rights are still very poorly protected, and there are many violations, and manufacturers or employers can get away with these violations because they are not necessarily afraid for prosecution. There is officially a democratic regime, but there is also a kind of shadow state of an unofficial network of businessmen, bureaucrats, oligarchies, criminals that collaborate to repress trade unions. They often use gangs of pre-men to attack trade unions or intimidate them. And then there is the role of the old union that still plays an important role in segments of the trade union movement, and is not necessarily working on behalf of workers. So there's still the old traditional trade union that can be a huge barrier for sincere unions to operate well within in factories, and employers often collaborate with these legacy unions to keep other unions out of the factory. And next slide, please. So we have seen there is a huge trade union growth in Indonesia since the fall of Suharto. Still, only 2.5% of Indonesians are part of the trade union. In electronics in the industrial area, it's a bit higher, 70%. And within electronics, it's probably even much more, even higher, because electronics is, as said before, concentrated in Bekasi and Batam. And here, trade unions are very active. The metal union is very active, and many more factories are unionized. So I don't have precise figures, but it would probably be over 50% of factories that has been unionized in these areas. So in Batam, for example, the metal union has been active in 27 factories and has been able to conclude collective bargaining agreements in 14 of them. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, we can see that there is a kind of change in labor regime from the very authoritarian era to a new one that allows for freedom of association, at least on paper, or but in practice, this is undermined in many different ways because of the barriers I mentioned earlier, but also very important is the creation of a flexible labor market, whereby more and more workers are employed under temporary working conditions, contracts, and that undermines very much the strength of trade unions in Indonesia.
Jeroen, sorry to interrupt. You have 1 minute more.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Just let's go on quickly. So maybe next slide, please. So from the survey, we found that more or less half of the workers are on temporary contracts, often for many years, and there is a growing use of interns, which has also been seen in other countries. But there is also in Bekasi, you can see there's a growing use of interns that often students, but they often work on very poor conditions. Next slide. Or maybe go to the final one. So basically to conclude, what we found is that Indonesia stands out comparatively quite well compared to other countries. There has been a trade union movement that has been quite successful in large mobilizations and also in getting access to unions and even collective bargaining, which is almost absent in most other countries. But still, the let's say market flexibility is rapidly increasing and makes it more difficult for unions to establish themselves, and it's eroding their power. International competition and a neoliberal agenda that is basically part of the omnibus law on job creation that will further flexibilize working conditions and employment relations, that will most likely further undermine the role of the trade union. And there's much more to say, but that will have to wait for another occasion. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Jeroen. Sorry, the time is very, very limited. Shall we go to Fahmi? Fahmi, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. Even my time will be very short, 5 minutes, to complement the presentation by Jeroen. Just want to comment several points. One, I agree that in the past decades, the union movements has enhanced the union density, at least the political struggle for freedom of associations. So my conclusion is that the freedom of association is political issue. But of course, it's political because it is a struggle from below, from the workers who are fighting for that freedom, and at the same time, the corporations are also trying to narrow down the political space by, like Jeroen has mentioned, hiring the gangster thugs to intimidate the union activists. So again, freedom of associations, in particular in Indonesia, is a social space where the spatial arrangement shape labor relations and also being produced by those relations. Corporations also play a major role in shaping the space for political freedom or freedom of association of the workers by way of limiting the space for the freedom of association of the workers to organize. So it's politically saturated. It's a political matter. It's not gain without political struggle and direct actions by the workers. Remember, in the past, in 2011, 2012, that was the time when the workers really struggle. They for 7 months they occupied the factories. That's part of the political freedom. That's part of the freedom of association by the workers. But ironically, Jeroen mentioned the union density. I quote, union density in Indonesia is quite low. Overall, it's overall is 6%. I quote I2C data in a couple of years ago. So I believe this hasn't gone up like Jeroen mentioned, 12. But of course, data is different from one institution to another, but it's still very low. But out of 6% of union density, only 5% out of it has collective bargaining agreements. So that's also barriers that the union has been facing. So I would better update about the situation in a couple of days ago, following the May Day rally, May Day struggle, May Day movements. Police arrest more than 20 people in Jakarta and 14 protesters in Sumatra, North Sumatra, because of they are trying to articulate their political freedom. They are trying to fight. They're trying to speak up against injustice. against union busting. So union busting, ironically, it's also part of union's major agenda in order to fight for their freedom of association. So, again, I would conclude with reflections that freedom of associations is political matter. Sometimes it is difficult to articulate, political expressions on the streets by the workers. Sometimes it's easy, but many times it's also difficult. Like a couple of days ago, when a number of workers tried to protest against the policies, against the corporations who are violating labor rights. So it's indeed a political matter, political issue. So it is part of political struggle of unions. I would end there. Hope we can discuss further later. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahmi and Jeroen. We will go to our next speaker before we have a discussion and maybe have some questions. And for all participants, you can, if there's any question, you can type down in the chat box, and I will deliver the questions to the speakers. Okay, I'm inviting our second speaker. She's Heather White. Heather White is a documentary filmmaker and also research consultant with 20 years of experience in international advocacy on labor and human rights issues. Her documentary film, Complicit, co-directed with Lin Zhang, won 9 international festival awards. Heather is the founder of Verite, a global non-profit organization monitoring factories in 60 countries. Heather will discuss the Uyghur forced labor in the electronic supply chain and beyond. And Heather, the time is yours. You have 15 minutes. I will let you know when the time is almost up.
Okay, thank you, Dina. And thank you, Jeroen and Fahmi, for a very interesting description of what's happening in Indonesia with respect to freedom of association. I think I'll just open my remarks by comparing the freedom of association situation just briefly in China, because it's an environment that's so completely different from what Indonesia has been experiencing, because China doesn't allow any freedom of association or collective bargaining. But that has not stopped global corporations from choosing to do business there for the last 25 years plus, despite the fact that their codes of conduct, most of which are now based on the core conventions of the International Labor Organization in Geneva, those codes of conduct, almost all of them state that they support freedom of association, that they want to work in countries and with suppliers who respect freedom of association, yet that's not the case in China. And the situation there has not been evolving and getting better, as the previous presentation pointed out, but there have been significant improvements over the last several years. In fact, China's been experiencing a major crackdown on labor activists, on civil society in general, on NGOs, and also on the press, which already was not free and highly censored, but it's actually gotten worse over the last decade. And there's been almost no response from the international community with respect to what the impact has had on workers there. It's a little known fact that, in fact, workers in China protest regularly, and the government reports that there are over 30,000 labor actions annually, strikes, work slowdowns, and direct confrontation with factory management. And the government often is known for underreporting on situations that may cause embarrassment, but they do report that there are 30,000. So we can just imagine how many more there might actually be that go unreported officially. So turning to Xinjiang, China. Oh, can we start my presentation? I was told that you guys, that you guys were going to run it for me. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief background because I think that there are quite a few people who might not be aware of the situation of what's happening there, which has been described as a forced labor situation. Modern slavery has been used as a designation recently. And in fact, Western governments are now speaking out about what is determined to be a serious situation of human rights violations taking place in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is in the northwestern region of China and has been an occupied territory since 1949 when the Chinese army moved in. And it's basically been run by the Chinese army and the military. The local people, the Uyghurs, who are descended from the Turkish ethnic group, call Xinjiang East Turkestan. So if you see in any media coverage, people being interviewed referring to East Turkestan, they're referring to Xinjiang. Ethnic tensions have been on the rise there, which is one of the reasons for the government crackdown, which began more aggressively in 2009, but actually goes back to 2005 when there were a number of incidents, which led the Chinese government to describe an independence movement as Islamic terrorism. And because of what was happening around the world with concerns around jihadism and the rise of ISIS, most governments decided that they were going to look away and not criticize China for a crackdown on what they said was an internal domestic matter that was connected to a wider Islamic rise of extremism, which has actually been very unhelpful in terms of how difficult it's been for human rights advocates of China to raise awareness about what's happening in Xinjiang, and it affects buyers of products from China very directly because now there's a situation where workers from Xinjiang have been shipped to factories around the country to work. We could go to the next slide. So there have been allegations of forced labor and genocide recently in the media that you may have read about. There have been several documented reports by BBC, CNN, and others about the creation of internment camps for Uyghurs. There's an estimated somewhere between 1 and 3 million, which shows you how unreliable the reporting is in terms of the ability to actually get accurate numbers of how many people have been interned in these detention camps. Some are putting the number at over 1 million, some are saying 2 million, and more recent estimates have gone as high as 3 million Uyghurs being incarcerated in detention centers. And they're also being shipped to factories to work across China. There's been some estimates of over 80,000 Uyghurs being shipped to factories in central China and also on the southern coast. When I was working on my documentary, I encountered a couple of factories that reported that they had Uyghur workers there. At the time, it was not a hot button issue, so people would still openly talk about it. There wasn't the type of pressure that there is right now from the international community, which has resulted in factories being very reluctant to talk about whether or not they have Uyghur workers. And that has an impact on the procurement process because people are not able to get very accurate or correct information when their only source of information is coming from the factories. Some of the more extreme allegations of what's happening in Xinjiang have extended to some proof that the government has been building crematoriums in the region, dozens of crematoriums where they've hired 50 security guards or more as staff. There have also been photographs of organ fast lanes near some of the more than 20 airports that have also been recently built in the region. So I'm not going to go into a lot of information about the more extreme allegations of organ harvesting of Uyghurs and some of the allegations of rape and murder. But if you want me to post some links in the chat, I'd be happy to do so because I have collected some of the international reporting. I think it's very credible reporting in terms of the amount of research that's gone into it and the interviews with credible witnesses. Again, because of the news blackout from the region, it's very difficult to get on the ground accounts except from people who've been escaping from China and applying for refugee status in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. There's over 10,000 Uyghurs that are currently in Turkey. They're actually at risk of deportation. So it's become an issue that I think that all of us who are involved in the worker rights community should be increasingly aware of, because the Chinese government has engaged in quite a bit of pushback in terms of the criticisms. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so specifically for global firms in the electronics industry, there are credible allegations that a workforce of Uyghurs has been infiltrating factories in the electronics sector in the central and southern parts of the country, which is actually thousands of miles away from Xinjiang, where they live. Witnesses have reported that they've been given ultimatums that if they don't accept jobs in factories 1,000 or more miles away from where they live, they will either be sent into a detention camp or family land will be seized by the government. And so that's one of the reasons why the forced labor designation has been applied to the situation. And it's also a big challenge to find out whether or not this is actually the case in any individual factory, where buyers might be trying to get information about whether or not there's a workforce of Uyghurs there and under what circumstances they took their jobs, and whether or not they're there under their own free will. There's a growing list of electronics companies that have been implicated in factories that have been known to have Uyghur workers. For example, Samsung, Apple, Amazon. There's a company called Hikvision, which has been in the media recently, which produces surveillance cameras. Public buyers hopefully will engage directly with these brands with respect to what's happening in their suppliers in China, with respect to a Uyghur workforce. There's been an effort by literally hundreds of NGOs to engage with companies that have been identified with Uyghur labor in their workforces, and there's been very little response from the brands. Many of them have not replied to letters asking for specific information. There's a company called O-Film, which has been in the media as a major supplier of lenses for Apple, who also mentioned that their customers include Lenovo and Samsung, Dell, HP, LG, and Huawei, which is a Chinese company. But O-Film is one of the few suppliers that's been widely identified with Uyghur labor, just because of the challenges for journalists. Journalists, if they try to do the research, they're being monitored, they're being followed, they're being threatened. The situation has gotten very difficult to try to get information out about this, but 5 suppliers of Apple have been identified, and efforts by NGOs to engage with Apple on the issue have been largely unsuccessful. Apple is kind of the major company that advocates try to engage with in terms of their China supply chain, because they use China almost exclusively for production of the iPhone and the iPad. Almost 100% of the production is in China, which is actually not the case for Samsung, Dell, Microsoft, and others, because as Uren's recent chart showed, those companies are actually spread out across Southeast Asia and have significant presence in other countries in Southeast Asia, whereas Apple is largely, the majority of their suppliers are in China. So for those thinking of engaging with brands on this issue, I think Apple stands out probably as the largest one to be challenging on the topic. There's been already quite a bit of advocacy on the apparel sector side, because apparel was initially identified as being one of the industries that had significant investment in Xinjiang. It's since come out that in the electronic sector, Xinjiang is also highly involved in the production of polysilicon, the world's largest, and also solar panels. But originally the pressure was on the apparel industry because there was, oh, I'm starting to hear an echo. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, and
Yes.
You have 1 minute left, Heather.
Oh, okay. Initially the campaign started in apparel and it's moved on to electronics. So we can go to the next slide. All right, one of the challenges for brands has been when they try to engage on this issue, if the Chinese government hears about it, they get targeted in the Chinese media and are designated as bad brands that are worthy of boycotts. There have even been celebrities, rock stars and actors that have been hired to speak out against those brands on social media. H&M is one, Nike, The Gap, there have been several. And those campaigns you can read about online. But that's having a quelling effect actually on brands that want to speak out in terms of the modern slavery and the forced labor designations. They're even removing the language from their websites, because as the information is shared on social media across China just from their websites, then they've become the targets for criticism. Okay, we could go to the next slide. All right, so I'm here basically providing some of the headlines that have appeared in the global media recently. But basically, the onus is upon the factories. And I hope that the buyers will be using language in their communication with the factories that they need to provide credible evidence that there is no Uyghur labor or forced labor in their factories. Not, are you using Uyghur labor in your factories? Because the answer is going to be no. Nobody is going to say that they are anymore. So basically, I think that the pressure needs to be on the brands in the sense of they need to provide proof and evidence that there is not forced labor, there is not modern slavery, and whether or not there is a Uyghur workforce in their factories, the likelihood that they will admit to it is relatively low. So the assumption should be at this point that yes, there is, and what are they doing about it? Otherwise, there have been calls for exit, there have been calls for buyers to, in writing, assert that they're going to be reducing the amount of their purchases from their Chinese suppliers until they can provide credible evidence. And this has been taken up by more than 200 organizations worldwide now, as well as Western governments. And I'll stop there. I can put some more information in the chat if people would like some links. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. That was quite shocking how the situation of Uyghur labor in Xinjiang. And we have very limited time, so I will just invite our next speaker, He is Olof Björnsson from Swedwatch. Olof is a human rights researcher and project manager at Swedwatch, an NGO based in Stockholm. His research mainly relates to migrant workers' rights in the Gulf region, factory workers' exposure to hazardous chemicals in the Philippines, and corporate responsibility in conflict zones. Olof will present Swedwatch's latest research in the Philippines on how women workers in ICT supply chains are affected by the chemicals they used in the production. The time is yours, Olof, and you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, I will try to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so my name is Olof Björnsson, and I am a human rights researcher at Swedwatch. Swedwatch is a Stockholm-based NGO, and we investigate how human rights and the environment are affected by corporate activities. And we work across all sectors and all continents, basically, but we specialize in particularly dangerous contexts where the risk of human rights abuse is higher. Sorry, the research I will talk about today was funded partly by the European Union through the Make ICT Fair project. So this most recent research concerned women who are exposed to hazardous chemicals when they manufacture electronic components. I don't have a lot of time, as you heard, but I hope to talk both about the pretty horrible health consequences that these chemicals have on the women, and as well about the specific context of the Philippines, and try to explain a little bit how the issue of chemicals is related to the issue of human rights. I've worked with this issue since 2019, and this research has resulted in 2 publications. The first is a report where I interviewed workers in the ICT sector in the Philippines about their working conditions and their health. And the second is what we call a research briefing, where I asked 5 major tech brands that source components from the Philippines what they're doing to address these issues. I will talk more about all this later. Just please note that these publications can be found on the Swedwatch website if you're interested or have any questions, and you can also always get in touch with me. First, I just want to mention something. We've heard about a lot of different human rights aspects of electronics manufacturing in this past hour, but I really want to talk about chemicals and ICT production. I'm not sure just how clearly it shows in the picture on the right there, but if it's one thing that you should know before we start, is that the ICT sector is an extremely chemical intensive sector. It's not like perhaps some say that it's a clean sector. I mean, every single item, every mobile phone, laptop, or tablet is made up of hundreds, maybe thousands components. And in every stage of their manufacture, humans and the environment are exposed to chemicals. And it starts with the mining of minerals and extraction of oil throughout manufacturing, and even after the product is used and we throw it away, what we call e-waste. It can continue to leak chemicals into the environment. Now, this complex process of making a phone, as we've been told today, is very much a global operation, where these many different components are manufactured in different parts of the world, often in countries in Asia, you know, like the Philippines, Vietnam, China, and Indonesia. We've heard about, of course, about China and Indonesia today. I will talk about the Philippines, where I did my research. The Philippines is a country that is pretty far down in the supply chain of these products. And by that, we mean that the workers in the Philippines manufacture components that are used in other components that end up in the finished product that you have in your pocket right now. They also manufacture a lot of related products like chargers and headphones and things that maybe doesn't require the same tech as semiconductors or microchips. I will talk a little bit also about why the products are made in places like the Philippines. I mean, it's a matter of cutting costs for the companies, of course. This industry has its roots in the US, in Silicon Valley, in California. But as we all know, the manufacturing of these products has shifted to countries with lower wages, and also to countries where the protection of workers is weaker. And this is also where workers are exposed to hazardous chemicals today. It's worth mentioning that workers in the US in the 80s and 90s, they also suffered horrible effects of chemical exposure. They had the cancers and the miscarriages and all the symptoms that workers in Asia are experiencing today. So it's pretty clear when you look at it with a bit of perspective that it's not just the costs and the manufacture that's being outsourced. It's also the human rights impacts in this sector. To make this a bit easier to take in, I've divided this presentation into two parts. First, a bit of background into the Philippines and the situation there, and then a brief look into my research on hazardous chemicals and how workers' health are affected by the chemicals. To say that unions are weak in the Philippines is actually a grave understatement. Unions are legal, but only a few % of the workers are actually unionized. And for 5 years running, the International Trade Union Confederation has named the Philippines one of the worst countries in the world to be a worker. And this is mainly due to the many violent attacks against union members and other activists. This is, of course, related to the general situation for human rights in the Philippines, where murders of human rights defenders are quite commonplace. According to Freedom House, an NGO, the Philippines has the second highest number of murdered human rights defenders in the world, second only to Colombia, I think. The situation is especially bad in the so-called economic zones, special economic zones, because the zones market themselves and try to attract investors and manufacturers using slogans like "No union, no strike, no problem." So what does ITUC really mean when they call the Philippines a context of extreme state violence and suppression of civil liberties? Well, it's basically anyone who speaks up for workers' rights, be it the right to organize or bargain collectively, or even the right to have a say in occupational health and safety, are experiencing constraints or denials of their freedom of speech and assembly. Intimidation and violent attacks are common, as the government regularly label unions as enemies of the state, which then leads to these murders, or the extrajudicial killings, as they call in the Philippines. And in the last few years, 56 union leaders and other labor rights activists have been murdered. Of course, we can't go into detail about all of these, but I will talk about one because of the relation to the electronics sector. This is Dandy Miguel, He's only one of many murdered union leaders in the Philippines. A little more than a month ago, he was shot 8 times as he was on his way home on his motorcycle. I only met him briefly, actually, in the Philippines, but I know that he was working to improve the working conditions in a factory that makes components for some of the world's biggest ICT brands. These are companies that manufacture products that you most likely use every day in your home or at work. So I hope the stage is set at this point regarding workers' rights in the Philippines. I mean, you cannot bring up issues of unionization, collective bargaining, and occupational health and safety if you're constantly being afraid of being murdered. So what about the actual working conditions in the electronic sector in the Philippines? In my work, I joined forces with a local partner organization, CTUHR, and we interviewed people working in the industry.
Sorry.
Yep.
You have 5 minutes left.
Yep. I can't really go into details because I don't have the time, but I will give you a brief snapshot of the situation before I have to round off. The women I interviewed, because they're mostly women, work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, manufacturing components and products for some of the world's major ICT brands. They were exposed to many hazardous chemicals without training and proper information, without the ventilation and without protective equipment. They say that talking about the chemicals with their manager is not possible, and anyone who raised the question of worker safety risks losing their job. All interviewees stated that in their factories, workers are exposed to DCM, toluene, and lead. I don't expect you to know in detail about these substances, but suffice to say, there are 3 very hazardous substances, and you can learn more about them if you look into my research. Workers said that they experienced dizziness, headaches, chest pains, muscle spasms, and a compromised immune system. These women suffer from irregular periods, myoma, and difficulties conceiving. They are experiencing miscarriages and stillbirths. They also suffer from frequent cancers, mainly breast cancer and ovarian cancer, but also talk about thyroid cancer and leukemia. And before I round off, I just want to give you some idea of the stories I was told by these workers. These are their words. If we want to know whether the chemicals are dangerous, the manager asks us if we want the job or not. They say that we applied for the job and should not be complaining. I'm the 4th woman in our production line to get cancer. I got breast cancer and the others got ovarian cancer. There was another woman who died, but I'm not sure if it was cancer or not. We had a colleague who died of thyroid cancer. She worked the night shift at the soldering station for 7 years, and then she died at the age of 26. You will sometimes see female workers fainting or silently crying while at work. We were given a safety orientation, but no one told us about the risks. We were told how to perform the task, but the chemicals and their effect on the body, that was not included in the orientation. I have had several miscarriages. I never got cancer, but several of my co-workers got ovarian cancer or breast cancer. I had 2 miscarriages, and I know of another worker who had 1. She eventually needed surgery to her ovaries. We have to endure in silence. We have to endure the pain every day because we need the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Olaf, and thank you all of the speakers for the very interesting presentations, and especially for the last one, how we learned that those workers that make our electronic products have faced so many things, and they affected by all the chemicals that they use at production of the things that they produce for the electronic products that we use and we bought. So we have 10 minutes for questions. If should there be any question, I received one, but actually Heather already answered the question. But nevertheless, I will just read the questions. What does airport with organ fast lanes refer to? Does it refer to human organs trafficking? And would you, Heather, would you please answer that? I know you already wrote in the chat box, but could you please say more about that?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. Well, my answer basically refers to the fact that China has the largest organ transplant industry in the world, and that has been called into question in recent years. There have been many hearings that have been held about it because physicians are concerned about how easy it is to get an organ if you go to China. There's something that's been called transplant tourism that has started appearing, covered by the media, about tourists arriving from abroad and being able to obtain at short order livers, kidneys, eyes, I mean, things that normally in other countries people are having to wait years to obtain, if ever, because of the long waiting lists. But China is able to supply them. These are state-run hospitals. It's not a black market situation where people are going below the radar, but they're actually working with government-run hospitals. There have been some escaped doctors who've given interviews. You can read about some of the stories that they tell on YouTube. There's been quite a bit of interesting reporting about it from credible sources. And the allegations are that Uyghurs are being used in these forced organ harvesting surgeries, which is why some critics are saying they've built so many new airports, why there are crematoriums that are being built very close to these airports and detention centers, and the organ fast lanes are to be able to get organs onto airplanes and shipped around the country where these various hospitals are. It's a really horrifying possibility, but I think it's really important for people to be aware of what's happening because the term genocide is now being used, and it's really important for us as consumers not to be financing it because we're buying products that are being sold to us by these factories that global brands are continuing to produce. They're not answering questions about it. And we as consumers need a lot more information. And there's now a call for boycotts by a number of organizations.
Okay, thank you, Heather. And let's make I make note that we're about the campaign and also the boycott for the products. And there's no more question. It's all of send the link for the report on hazardous chemicals in the chat box. Anybody who are interested in reading the report could go to the link. And I have a question for Jeroen and also Fahmi, as I'm also based in Indonesia, but I have a general question under this COVID-19 pandemic, and this would pose more barrier, I think, to the freedom of association. As Fahmi just said that last May Day in Jakarta, under the charge of breaching the no gathering rules in Indonesia. In Jakarta, there were the mass and the protesters, the demonstrators were not allowed to, were just arrested and then that's one of the pretexts of the worsening of freedom of association under this COVID-19. What can you say about this, and what are the possibilities, or maybe what are the chances for the labor movement and also CSO to further and to come up with a new strategy of organizing as the under this COVID-19 with the current situation?
Jeroen, you want to start?
Yeah. Now I must say I'm not very aware of the latest developments, so there Fami could probably say more. I think we did ask a few questions in the survey on the impact of COVID-19. But we could not necessarily find a way that it was impacting trade union rights at that point of time, right? Which is a half year ago. But we had more questions about health and safety measures and the role of the union in that. And of course, I think, and again, my data is not up to date, but half year ago, at the beginning of there was a fear that there would become a great recession, economic recession, and that electronics industry and the interruption of supply chains would cause many factories to close down. I think by now, I think most people would say that the electronics industry has benefited in general of a rise in demand. So I'm not sure to what extent it has an impact on employment, and because what we found in the survey is that overtime had decreased, right? So it had an impact on income because the hours of overtime were less than before the crisis. But probably that is already that's no longer the case. Of course, what I said, maybe Fami could say more about the Indonesian context today. But of course, we see in many countries, a misuse of COVID-19 measures to repress trade unions and to stop organizers and to stop demonstrations. So it's a general trend, especially in India, we have seen this, but also in other countries. But again, I don't know, but Fami could probably come in now and say something about the current situation in Indonesia.
Yeah, the workers in general, including in electronics, try to express their aspirations, political aspirations, on the street again, because they are missing the street as a real political ground for expressing the aspirations. Certainly during the COVID pandemic, majority of the workers and the unions have been using online platform for their education, for their meetings, for their gathering on union matters. But May Day is very, very special. May Day or Labor Day in Indonesia is just, recognized as a public holiday, recognized as International Labor Day, just in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, because we have been demanding the government to make it public holiday, to recognize the significance of Labor Day. So that's a political struggle by the workers. So May Day is important, and on 2nd May, it's also Education Day. It's a commemoration of Education Day. So the workers were collaborating with the students. And workers and students on 2nd May, they gather and they demand political change. They demand justice to the governments. And in the afternoon of the 2nd May, they were arrested, and in many places it was violence by the police, and of course using the reasons that it's COVID prevention measures. But the workers have the arguments. They follow the health protocol. They follow the health protocol so that they are still legal to express their political aspirations. They use masks and keep distance, physical distancing, and so forth. And this is to show to the government, to the public, that we are not violating any rules. But certainly this is not easy to convince the states and the governments. And of course, during this is also special because this is in Indonesia is a majority Muslim people approaching in celebrating Idul Fitri, and many unions and many workers, they are not receiving annual bonus, which is as stipulated by the law. So this is part of the struggle that workers are trying to demand the governments to fulfill. So basically, this is a difficult. Again, this is political issue. Last points I want to say is that freedom of association is somehow useless, because since the number of informal or irregular or outsourced or daily workers are increasing, and they are discouraged to join the union. So this is also another challenge and another barrier for us to fight for. Thank you.
Thank you for me. And that your last statement would also be make difficult for workers to voice and to speak about the chemicals and also the impact of chemicals that they having in their body, including for what happened, including what Olaf just said and presented in the Philippines. I think that's also very similar what happened in the Philippines, also in Indonesia and other production countries. And with that, I'm closing this session. I would like to say thank you so much to Jeroen, Fahmi, Heather, and also Olaf for the presentations. And with this, I close the session. Thank you so much. Have a good day. And go back to Georgina.
Yeah, Georgina, thank you. Thank you, Dina. I want to thank you all the participants for this last panel, Jeroen Merk, Fahmi Pijnbak, Heather White, Olaf Björnsson, and of course, Dina Septi from Indonesia. Bé, doncs posem punt i final a aquesta taula d'avui, certament molt impactant, amb tots els testimonis que ens han acompanyat durant aquesta última hora, i també fent un seguiment a aquesta última taula, saludar els alumnes i professors del Centre de Formació d'Adults Rius i Taulet de l'Institut Lluís Vives i de l'Institut La Guineueta, que ens estan seguint, com dèiem, aquesta última taula d'avui. I a aquesta hora hem arribat ja a la cloenda d'aquesta primera jornada. Moltes gràcies a totes i a tots. Abans d'acabar, sí que vull agrair a Setem i a tot l'equip, que això sí que no ho he dit a l'inici, per haver comptat i confiat en mi per aquesta primera jornada. Esperem que us hagi agradat. Ha estat molt intensa, molt enriquidora. I recordeu que demà ens tornem a trobar en aquesta sala virtual a 3:15. L'encarregada de conduir l'acte demà serà la periodista Marta Molina. La segona jornada tractarà de la contínua cadena de producció, ús i consum dels nostres aparells electrònics i on van a parar un cop prescindim d'ells. També es parlarà de les alternatives i es presentaran algunes iniciatives locals, no us ho perdeu, i tingueu en compte que la connexió serà des d'un altre enllaç diferent al que fins ara havíem utilitzat d'aquest primer dia i us el vam facilitar per correu electrònic. Si teniu qualsevol dubte també sabeu que podeu contactar amb Setem. Moltíssimes gràcies i posem punt i final a aquesta primera jornada.